Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
Chapter 5.
"Them mastics,"
said Mr. Pickerskill, judicially.
"is a proper bugger."
I nodded my head in agreement that his mastitis problem was indeed giving cause for concern, and reflected at the same time that while most farmers would have been content with the local word felon, it was typical that Mr. Pickerskill should make a determined if somewhat inaccurate attempt to a scientific term. Sometimes he got very wide of the mark, as one time long after this, when artificial insemination, or AI, was gaining a foothold in the Dales, he made my day by telling me he had a cow in calf to the ICI. However, he usually did better than this. Most of his efforts were near misses or bore obvious evidence of their derivation. But I could never really fathom where he got the mastics. I did know that once he fastened on to an expression, it never changed. Mastitis had always been them mastics with him, and it always would be. And I knew, too, that nothing would ever stop him doggedly trying to be right. Because Mr. Pickerskill had what he considered to be a scholastic background. He was a man of about 60, and when in his teens, he had attended a 2-week course of instruction for agricultural workers at Leeds University. This brief glimpse of the academic life had left an indelible impression on his mind, and it was as if the intimation of something deep and true behind the facts of his everyday work had kindled a flame in him which had illumined his subsequent life. No Captain Gown Don ever looked back to his years among the spires of Oxford with more nostalgia than did Mr. Pickerskill to his fortnight at Leeds, and his conversation was usually laced with references to the godlike Professor Malleson, who had apparently been in charge of the course. "I don't know what to make of it," he continued. "In my college days I was always told that you got a big swollen bag and dirty milk with them mastics, but this one must be another kind. Just little bits of flakes in the milk off and on. Neither nowt nor something, but I'm right fed up with it, I can tell you." I took a sip from the tea which Mrs. Pickerskill had placed in front of me on the kitchen table. Yes, it's very worrying the way it keeps going on and on. I'm sure there's a definite factor behind it all. I wish I could put my finger on it." But in fact, I had a good idea what was behind it. I had happened in at the little bar late one afternoon when Mr. Pickerskill and his daughter Olive were milking their 10 cows. I had watched the two at work as they crouched under the row of roan and redbacks, and one thing was immediately obvious. While Olive drew the milk by almost imperceptible movements of her fingers and with a motionless wrist, her father hauled away at the teats as though he was trying to ring in the new year. This insight, coupled with the fact that it was always the cows Mr. Pickerskill milked that gave trouble, was enough to convince me that the chronic mastitis was of traumatic origin. But how to tell the farmer that he wasn't doing his job right, and that the only solution was to learn a more gentle technique, or let Olive take over all the milking? It wouldn't be easy, because Mr. Pickerskill was an impressive man. I don't suppose he had a spare penny in the world, but even as he sat there in the kitchen in his tattered, collarless flannel shirt and braces, he looked, as always, like an industrial tycoon. You can imagine that massive head with its fleshy cheeks, noble brow and serene eyes looking out from the financial pages of the Times. Put him in a bowler and striped trousers, and you'd have the perfect chairman of the board. I was very chary of affronting such natural dignity, and anyway, Mr. Pickerskill was fundamentally a fine stocksman. His few cows, like all the animals of that fast-dying breed of small farmer, were fat and sleek and clean. You had to look after your beasts when they were your only source of income, and somehow Mr. Pickerskill had brought up a family by milk production, eked out by selling a few pigs and the eggs from his wife's 50 hens. I could never quite work out how they did it, but they lived, and they lived graciously. All the family but Olive had married and left home, but there was still a rich decorum and harmony in that house. The present scene was typical. The farmer expounding gravely, Mrs. Pickerskill bustling about in the background, listening to him with quiet pride. Olive, too, was happy. Though in her late 30s, she had no fears of spinsterhood, because she had been assiduously courted for 15 years by Charlie Hudson from the Darrowby fish shop, and though Charlie was not a tempestuous suitor, there was nothing flighty about him. and he was confidently expected to pop the question over the next 10 years or so. Mr. Pickerskill offered me another buttered scone, and when I declined, he cleared his throat a few times as though trying to find words.
"Mr. Herriot," he said at last, "I don't like to tell anybody his job, but we've tried all your remedies for them mastics, and we've still got trouble. Now, when I studied under Professor Malison, I noted down a lot of good cures, and I'd like to try this one. Have a look at it."
He put his hand into his hip pocket and produced a yellow slip of paper almost falling apart at the folds.
"It's an udder salve. Maybe if we give the bags a good rub with it, it'll do trick."
I read the prescription in the fine copperplate writing. Camphor, eucalyptus, zinc oxide. A long list of old familiar names. I couldn't help feeling a kind of affection for them, but it was tempered by a growing disillusion. I was about to say that I didn't think rubbing anything on the udder would make the slightest difference, when the farmer groaned loudly. The action of reaching into his hip pocket had brought on a twinge of his lumbago, and he sat very upright, gasping with pain.
"Oh, this bloody old back of mine! By God, it does give me some stick. The doctor can't do naught about it. I've had enough pills to make me rattle, but I get no relief."
I'm not brilliant, but I do get the odd blinding flash, and I have one now. "Mr. Pickerskill," I said solemnly, "you've suffered from that lumbago ever since I've known you. And I've just thought of something. I believe I know how to cure it." The farmer's eyes widened, and he stared at me with a childlike trust in which there was no trace of scepticism. This could be expected, because just as people place more reliance on the words of knackermen and meal travellers than their vets where their animals are concerned, it was natural that they would believe the vet rather than their doctor with their own ailments.
"You know how to put me right?"
he said faintly. "I think so, and it has nothing to do with medicine. You'll have to stop milking."
"Stop milking? What the hell?"
"Of course, don't you see? It's sitting crouched on that little stool night and morning every day of the week that's doing it. You're a big chap, and you've got to bend to get down there. I'm sure it's bad for you." Mr. Pickerskill gazed into space, as though he had seen a vision.
"You really think?"
"Yes, I do." "Well, you ought to give it a try anyway. Olive can do the milking. She's always saying she ought to do it all." "Well, that's right, Dad," Olive chimed in. "I like milking, you know I do. And it's time you gave it up. You've done it ever since you were a lad."
"Dang it, young man, I believe you're right. I'll pack it in now. I've made my decision."
Mr. Pickerskill threw up his fine head, looked imperiously around him, and crashed his fist on the table as though he had just concluded a merger between two oil companies. I stood up. Fine. Well, I'll take this prescription with me and make up the udder salve. It'll be ready for you tonight, and I should start using it immediately." It was about a month later that I saw Mr. Pickerskill. He was on a bicycle, pedalling majestically across the marketplace, and he dismounted when he saw me.
"Now then, Mr. Herriot,"
he said, puffing slightly. "I'm glad I've met you.
"I've been meaning to come and tell you that we don't have no flakes in the milk now. Ever since we started with salve, they began to disappear, and milk's as clear as it can be now."
"Oh, great. And, how's your lumbago?"
"Well, I'll tell you. You've really capped it, and I'm grateful. I've never milked since that day, and I hardly get a twinge now."
He paused and smiled indulgently.
"You gave me some good advice for me back, but we had to go back to our Professor Malison to cure them mastics, didn't we?"
My next encounter with Mr. Pickerskill was on the telephone.
"I'm speaking from the Cossack,"
he said in a subdued shout.
"From the what?" "The Cossack, the telephone Cossack in village."
"Oh, yes, indeed. And what can I do for you?"
"I want you to come out as soon as possible to treat a calf with semolina."
"I beg your pardon?"
"I have a calf with semolina."
"Semolina?"
"Ah, that's right. A fellow was on about it on wireless the other morning."
Oh, yes, I see. I too had heard a bit of the farming talk on salmonella infection in calves.
What makes you think you've got this trouble?" Well, it's like that fella said, me calf's bleeding from the rectum. From the... Oh, yes, of course, yeah. Well, I'd better have a look at him. I won't be long. The calf was pretty ill when I saw him, and he did have rectal bleeding, but it wasn't like salmonella. There's no diarrhoea, you see, Mr. Pickersgill, I said. In fact, he seems to be constipated. This is almost pure blood coming from him, and he hasn't got a very high temperature. The farmer looked a little disappointed. Dang, I thought it was just as that fellow was talking about. He said you could send samples off to the Labrador. Sorry, to the what? The investigation Labrador, you know. Oh, yes, quite. I don't think the lab will be of any help in this case. Ah, well, what's wrong with him then? Is something the matter with his rectum? No, but there seems to be some obstruction high up in his bowel which is causing this hemorrhage. I looked at the little animal standing motionless with his back up. He was totally preoccupied with some internal discomfort, and now and then he strained and grunted softly. And of course I should have known straight away. It was so obvious. But I suppose we all have blind spells when we can't see what is pushed in front of our eyes, and for a few days I played around with that calf in a haze of ignorance, giving it this and that medicine which I'd rather not talk about. But I was lucky. He recovered in spite of my treatment. It wasn't until Mr. Pickersgill showed me the little roll of necrotic tissue which the calf had passed that the thing dawned on me. I turned, shamefaced, to the farmer. This is a bit of dead bowel all telescoped together. An interception. It's usually a fatal condition, but fortunately in this case, the obstruction has sloughed away and your calf should be all right now. What was it you called it? An interception. Mr. Pickersgill's lips moved tentatively, and for a moment I thought he was going to have a shot at it, but he apparently decided against it. Oh, he said. That's what it was it? Yes, and it's difficult to say just what caused it. The farmer sniffed. I bet I know what was behind it. I've always said that this one would be a weakly calf. When he was born, he bled a lot from his biblical cord. Mr. Pickersgill hadn't finished with me yet. It was only a week later when I heard him on the phone again. Get out here, quick! There's one of me pigs going bezique. Bezique? With an effort I put away from me a mental picture of two porkers facing each other over a green baize table. I'm afraid I don't quite... Aye! I gave him a dose of worm medicine and he started jumping about and rolling on his back. I tell you, he's going proper bezique. Ah, yes! Yes, I see. Right. I'll be with you in a few minutes. The pig had quietened down a bit when I arrived, but was still in considerable pain, getting up, lying down, trotting in spurts round the pen. I gave him half a grain of morphine hydrochloride as a sedative, and within a few minutes he began to relax and finally curled up in the straw. Well, looks as though he's going to be all right, I said, but what's this worm medicine you gave him? Mr. Pickersgill produced the bottle sheepishly. Bloke was coming round selling them like. Said it would shift any worms you care to name. Well, it nearly shifted your pig, didn't it? I sniffed at the mixture. God, no wonder. It smells almost like pure turpentine. Turpentine? Well, by God, that's all it is. And bloke said it was somewhat new. Charged me an absorbent price for it, too. I gave him back the bottle. Well, never mind, I don't think there's any harm done, but I think the dustbin's the best place for that. As I was getting into my car, I looked up at the farmer. You must be about sick of the sight of me. First the mastitis, then the calf, and now the pig. You've had a bad run. Mr. Pickersgill squared his shoulders and gazed at me with massive composure. Again I was conscious of the sheer presence of the man. Young fella, he said, that don't bother me. Where there's stock, there's trouble. And I know from experience that trouble allus comes in cyclones.
Chapter 6. I knew I shouldn't do it, but the old Drover's Road beckoned to me irresistibly. I ought to be hurrying back to the surgery after my morning call, but the broad green path wound beguilingly over the moor-top between its crumbling walls, and almost before I knew, I was out of the car and treading the wiry grass. The wall skirted the hill's edge, and as I looked across and away to where Darrowby huddled far below between its folding green fells, the wind thundered in my ears. But when I squatted in the shelter of the grey stones, the wind was only a whisper, and the spring sunshine hot on my face. The best kind of sunshine. Not heavy or cloying, but clear and bright and clean as you find it down behind a wall in Yorkshire, with the wind singing over the top. I slid lower till I was stretched on the turf, gazing with half-closed eyes into the bright sky, luxuriating in the sensation of being detached from the world and its problems. This form of self-indulgence had become a part of my life, and still is. A reluctance to come down from the high country. A penchant for stepping out of the stream of life, and loitering on the brink for a few minutes as an uninvolved spectator. And it was easy to escape, lying up there quite alone with no sound but the wind sighing and gusting over the empty miles, and, far up in the wide blue, the endless brave trilling of the larks. Not that there was anything unpleasant about going back down the hill to Derby. I had worked there for 2 years now, and Scaledale House had become home, and the 2 bright minds in it, my friends. It didn't bother me that both the brothers were cleverer than I was. Siegfried, unpredictable, explosive, generous. I had been lucky to have him as a boss. As a city-bred youth trying to tell expert stock farmers how to treat their animals, I had needed all his skill and guidance behind me. And Tristan, a rum lad, as they say, but very sound. His humour and zest for life had lightened my days. And all the time I was adding practical experience to my theory. The mass of facts I had learned at college were all coming to life, and there was the growing realization, deep and warm, that this was for me. There was nothing else I'd rather do. It must have been about 15 minutes later when I finally rose, stretched pleasurably, took a last deep gulp of the crisp air, and pottered slowly back to the car for the 6-mile journey back down the hill to Derby. When I drew up by the railings with Siegfried's brass plate hanging lopsidedly by the fine Georgian doorway, I looked up at the tall old house with its ivy swarming untidily over the weathered brick. The white paint on windows and doors was flaking, and that ivy needed trimming, but the whole place had style, a serene, unchangeable grace. But I had other things on my mind at the moment. I went inside, stepping quietly over the coloured tiles which covered the floor of the long passage, till I reached the long offshoot at the back of the house. And I felt, as I always did, subdued excitement as I breathed the smell of our trade, which always hung there: ether, carbolic, and palv aromat. The latter was the spicy powder which we mixed with the cattle medicines to make them more palatable, and it had a distinctive bouquet which even now can take me back 30 years with a single sniff. And today the thrill was stronger than usual because my visit was of a surreptitious nature. I almost tiptoed along the last stretch of passage, dodged quickly round the corner and into the dispensary. Gingerly I opened the cupboard door at one end and pulled out a little drawer. I was pretty sure that Siegfried had a spare hoof-knife hidden away within, and I had to suppress a cackle of triumph when I saw it lying there, almost brand new, with a nicely turned, gleaming blade and a polished wooden handle. My hand was outstretched to remove it, when a cry of anger exploded in my right ear. "Caught in the act! Bloody red-handed, by God!" Siegfried, who had apparently shot up through the floorboards, was breathing fire into my face. The shock was so tremendous that the instrument dropped from my trembling fingers, and I cowered back against a row of bottles of formalin bloat mixture. "Oh, hello, Siegfried," I said with a ghastly attempt at nonchalance. Just on my way to that horse of Thompson's, you know, the one with a pus in the foot. I seem to have mislaid my knife, so I thought I'd borrow this one." "Thought you'd nick it, you mean? My spare hoof-knife, by heaven, is nothing sacred, James." I smiled sheepishly. "You're wrong. I'd have given it back to you straight away." "A likely story," Siegfried said, with a bitter smile. "I'd never have seen it again, and you know damn well I wouldn't. Anyway, where's your own knife? You've left it on some farm, haven't you?" "Well, as a matter of fact, I laid it down at Willie Denham's place after I'd finished trimming his cow's overgrown foot, and I must have forgotten to pick it up." I gave a light laugh. "But God help us, James, you're always forgetting to pick things up, and you're always making up the deficiency by purloining my equipment." He stuck his chin out. "Have you any idea how much all this is costing me?" "Oh, but I'm sure Mr. Denham will drop the knife in at the surgery the first time he's in town." Siegfried nodded gravely.
He may, I'll admit that, he may, but on the other hand, he might think it's the ideal tool for cutting up his plug tobacco. Remember when you left your carving overall at old Fred Dobson's place? The next time I saw it was 6 months later, and Fred was wearing it. He said it was the best thing he'd ever found for stooking corn in wet weather. Yes. Yes, I remember. I'm sorry about it all. I fell silent, breathing in the pungency of the pulv aromat. Somebody had let a bagful burst on the floor, and the smell was stronger than ever. My employer kept his fiery gaze fixed on me for a few moments more, then he shrugged his shoulders. "Ah, well, there's none of us perfect, James, and I'm sorry I shouted at you, but you know I'm deeply attached to that knife, and this business of leaving things around is getting under my skin." He took down a Winchester of his favourite colic draught and polished it with his handkerchief before replacing it carefully on its shelf. "I tell you what, let's go and sit down for a few minutes and talk about the problem." We went back along the passage, and as I followed him into the big sitting-room, Tristan got up from his favourite chair and yawned deeply. His face looked as boyish and innocent as ever, but the lines of exhaustion around his eyes and mouth told an eloquent story. Last night he had travelled with the darts team from the Lord Nelson and had taken part in a gruelling match against the Dog and Gun at Drayton. The contest had been followed by a pie and peas supper and the consumption of something like 12 pints of bitter a man. Tristan had crawled into bed at 3 a.m. and was clearly in a delicate condition. "Ah, Tristan!" Siegfried said. "I'm glad you're here, because what I have to say concerns you just as much as James. It's about leaving instruments on farms, and you're as guilty as he is." It must be remembered that before the Veterinary Surgeons Act of 1948, it was quite legal for students to treat cases, and they regularly did so. Tristan, in fact, had done much sterling work when called on, and he was very popular with the farmers. "Now, I mean this very seriously," my employer said, leaning his elbow on the mantelpiece and looking from one of us to the other. "You two are bringing me to the brink of ruin by losing expensive equipment. Some of it is returned, but a lot of it is never seen again. What's the use of sending you to visits when you come back without your artery forceps or scissors or something else? The profit's gone, you see." We nodded silently. "After all, there's nothing difficult about bringing your instruments away, is there? You may wonder why I never leave anything behind. Well, I can tell you it's just a matter of concentration. When I lay a thing down, I always impress on my mind that I've got to lift it up again. That's all there is to it." The lecture over, he became very brisk. "Right. Let's get on. There's nothing much doing, James, so I'd like you to come with me to Kendall's of Brookside. He's got a few jobs, including a cow with a tumour to remove. I don't know the details, but we may have to cast her. You can go on to Thompson's later." He turned to his brother. "And you'd better come too, Tristan. I don't know if we'll need you, but an extra man might come in handy." We made quite a procession as we trooped into the farmyard, and Mr. Kendall met us with his customary ebullience. "Hello, hello! We've got plenty of manpower today, I see. We'll be able to tackle out with this regiment." Mr. Kendall had the reputation in the district of being a bit clever, and the phrase has a different meaning in Yorkshire from elsewhere. It meant he was something of a know-all, and the fact that he considered himself a wag and leg-puller of the first degree didn't endear him to his fellow farmers either. I always felt he was a good-hearted man, but his conviction that he knew everything and had seen it all before made him a difficult man to impress. "Well, what do you want to see first, Mr. Fowden?" he asked. He was a thick-set little man with a round, smooth-skinned face and mischievous eyes. "I believe you have a cow with a bad eye," Siegfried said. "Better begin with that." "Right, Squire," the farmer cried. Then he put his hand in his pocket. "But before we start, here's something for you." He pulled forth a stethoscope. "You left it last time you were here." There was a silence. Then Siegfried grunted a word of thanks and grabbed it hastily from his hand. Mr. Kendall continued. "And the time before that, you left your bloodless castrators. We did a swap over, didn't we? I gave you back the nippers, and you left me the earphones." He burst into a peal of laughter. Yes, quite," Siegfried snapped, glancing uneasily round at us. "But we must be getting on. Now, where is... You know, lads, chuckled the farmer, turning to us. "I don't think I've ever known him come here without leaving summat."
"Really?" said Tristan, interestedly.
"Aye. If I wanted to keep 'em all, I'd have had a drawer full by now."
"Is that so?"
I said. "Aye, it is, young man. And it's the same with all me neighbours. One fellow said to me t'other day, 'He's a kind man, is that Mr. Fan, and never calls without leaving a souvenir.'"
He threw back his head and laughed again. We were enjoying the conversation, but my employer was stalking up the bar.
"Where's this damn cow, Mr. Kendall? We haven't got all day."
The patient wasn't hard to find. A nice, light-roan cow which looked round at us carefully, one eye almost closed. From between the lashes a trickle of tears made a dark stain down the hair of the face, and there was an eloquent story of pain in the cautious movements of the quivering lids. "Ah, there's something in there," murmured Siegfried.
"Aye, I know."
Mr. Kendall always knew.
"She's got a flipping great lump of chaff stuck on her eyeball, but I can't get to it. Look here."
He grabbed the cow's nose with one hand and tried to prise the eyelids apart with the fingers of the other. But the third eyelid came across and the whole orbit rolled effortlessly out of sight, leaving only a blank expanse of white sclera.
"There!"
he cried.
"Nowt to see. You can't make her keep her eyes still."
"I can, though." Siegfried turned to his brother.
"Tristan, get the chloroform muzzle from the car. Look sharp."
The young man was back in seconds, and Siegfried quickly drew the canvas bag over the cow's face and buckled it behind the ears. From a bottle of spirit he produced a small pair of forceps of an unusual type with tiny jaws operated by a spring. He poised them just over the closed eye. "James," he said, "give it about an ounce." I dribbled the chloroform onto the sponge in the front of the muzzle. Nothing happened for a few moments while the animal took a few breaths, then her eyes opened wide in surprise as the strange numbing vapour rolled into her lungs. The whole area of the affected eye was displayed, with a broad golden piece of chaff splayed out across the dark cornea. I only had a glimpse of it before Siegfried's little forceps had seized it and whisked it away.
"Squeeze in some of that ointment, Tristan," said my employer, "and get the muzzle off James before she starts to rock."
With the bag away from her face and the tormenting little object gone from her eye, the cow looked around her, vastly relieved. The whole thing had taken only a minute or two, and was as slick a little exhibition as you'd wish to see, but Mr. Kendall didn't seem to think a great deal of it.
"All right," he grunted. "Let's get on with next job."
As we went down the byre, I looked out and saw a horse being led across the yard. Siegfried pointed to it.
"Is that the gelding I operated on for fistulous withers?" he asked. "That's the one."
The farmer's voice was airy. We went out and Siegfried ran his hand over the horse's shoulders. The broad fibrous scar over the withers was all that was left of the discharging, stinking sinus of a few weeks back. Healing was perfect. These cases were desperately difficult to treat, and I remembered my boss cutting and chiselling at the mass of necrotic tissue, caressing deeply till only healthy flesh and bone remained. His efforts had been rewarded. It was a brilliant success. Siegfried gave the gelding a final pat on the neck.
"Ah, that's done rather well."
Mr. Kendall shrugged and turned back towards the byre.
"Aye, not bad, I suppose."
But he really wasn't impressed. The cow with the tumour was standing just inside the door. The growth was in the perineal region, a smooth, round object like an apple projecting from the animal's rear end, clearly visible an inch to the right of the tail. Mr. Kendall was in full cry again.
"Now we'll see what you're made of. How are you chaps going to get that thing off, eh? It's a big un. You'll need a carving knife or a hacksaw foot job. Are you going to put her to sleep or tie her up or what?"
He grinned, and his bright little eyes darted at each of us in turn. Siegfried reached out and grasped the tumour, feeling round the base with his fingers. Yes.
"Bring me some soap and water and a towel, will you please?" "I have it just outside door."
The farmer scuttled into the yard and back again with the bucket. "Thank you very much," Siegfried said. He washed his hands and gave them a leisurely toweling. "Now I believe you have another case to see. A scouring calf, wasn't it?" The farmer's eyes widened.
"Yes, I have, but how about getting that big lump off the cow first?"
Siegfried folded the towel and hung it over the half-door. "Oh, I've removed the tumour," he said quietly.
"What's that?"
Mr. Kendall stared at the cow's backside. We all stared at it. and there was no doubt about it. The growth was gone. And there was another funny thing. There wasn't even a scar or mark remaining. I was standing quite close to the animal, and I could see exactly, to a fraction of an inch, just where the big ugly projection had been. And there was nothing. Not a drop of blood. Nothing. "Aye," Mr. Kendall said, irresolutely. You've removed it, aye, that's right." The smile had vanished from his face, and his entire personality seemed suddenly deflated. Being a man who knew everything and was surprised by nothing, he was unable to say, "When the devil did you do it? And how? And what on earth have you done with it?" He had to maintain face at all costs, but he was rattled. He darted little glances around the byre along the channel. The cow was standing in a clean, swept stall with no straw, and there was nothing lying on the floor, there or anywhere. Casually, as though by accident, he pushed the milking stool to one side with his foot. Still, nothing. Well, now perhaps we can see the calf. Siegfried began to move away. Mr. Kendall nodded. "Yes, aye, the calf. He's in corner there. I'll just lift bucket first." It was a blatant excuse. He went over to the bucket, and as he passed behind the cow, he whipped out his spectacles, jammed them onto his nose, and directed a piercing glare at the cow's bottom. He only took an instant because he didn't want to show undue concern, but when he turned back towards us, his face registered utter despair, and he put his spectacles away with a weary gesture of defeat. As he approached, I turned and brushed against my employer. "Where the hell is it?" I hissed. "Up my sleeve," murmured Siegfried without moving his lips or changing expression. "What?" I began, but Siegfried was climbing over a gate into the makeshift pen where the calf was cornered. He was in expansive mood as he examined the little creature and injected it. He kept up a steady flow of light conversation, and Mr. Kendall, showing great character, managed to get his smile back on and answer back, but his preoccupied manner, his tortured eyes, and the repeated incredulous glances back along the byre floor in the direction of the cow betrayed the fact that he was under immense strain. Siegfried didn't hurry over the calf, and when he'd finished he lingered a while in the yard, chatting about the weather, the way the grass was springing, the price of fat bullocks. Mr. Kendall hung on grimly, but by the time Siegfried finally waved farewell, the farmer's eyes were popping, and his face was an anguished mask. He bolted back into the byre, and as the car backed round, I could see him bent double with his glasses on again, peering into the corners. "Poor fella," I said. "He's still looking for that thing. And for God's sake, where is it anyway?" "I told you, didn't I?" Siegfried removed one arm from the wheel and shook it. A round, fleshy ball rolled down into his hand. I stared at it in amazement. "But I never saw you take it off. What happened?" "Well, I'll tell you." My employer smiled indulgently. I was fingering it over to see how deeply it was attached when I felt it begin to move. The back of it was merely encapsulated by the skin, and when I gave it another squeeze, it just popped out and shot up my sleeve. And after it had gone, the lips of the skin sprang back together again so that you couldn't see where it had been. Extraordinary thing. Tristan reached over from the back seat. "Give it to me," he said. "I'll take it back to college with me and get it sectioned. We'll find out what kind of tumour it is." His brother smiled. "Yes, I expect you'll give it some fancy name, but I'll always remember it as the only thing that shook Mr. Kendall." "Well, that was an interesting session in there," I said. "And I must say I admired the way you dealt with that eye, Siegfried. Very smooth indeed." "Ah, you're very kind, James," my boss murmured. "Well, that was just one of my little tricks, and of course the forceps helped a lot." I nodded. Yes, wonderful little things. I've never seen anything like them. Where did you get them?" "Well, I picked them up from an instrument stall at the last veterinary congress. They cost me a packet, but they've been worth it. Look, let me show them to you." He put his hand in his breast pocket, then his side pockets, and as he continued to rummage all over his person, a look of sick dismay spread slowly over his face. Finally he abandoned the search, cleared his throat, and fixed his eyes on the road ahead. I'll show you them some other time, James," he said huskily. I didn't say anything, but I knew, and Siegfried knew, and Tristan knew. He'd left them on the farm.
Chapter 7. One of the nicest things about my married life was that my new wife got on so well with the Farnham brothers. And this was fitting, because both of them had done their utmost to further my suit. Siegfried by means of some well-timed kicks in the pants, Tristan by more subtle motivation. The young man had been reassuring when I consulted him in the dispensary about my wooing that early summer morning.
"Well, it's a good sign." Tristan reluctantly expelled a lungful of woodbine smoke and looked at me with wide, encouraging eyes. "You think so?" I said doubtfully. Tristan nodded. "Sure of it? Helen just rang you up, did she?" "Yes. Out of the blue. I haven't seen her since I took her to the pictures that night, and it's been hectic ever since with the lambing and suddenly there she was, asking me to tea on Sunday." "I like the sound of it," Tristan said. "But of course you don't want to get the idea you're home and dry or anything like that. You know there are others in the field." "Hell, yes. I suppose I'm one of a crowd." "Well, not exactly a crowd, but Helen Alderson is really something. Not just a looker, but... oh, very nice. There's a touch of class about that girl." "Oh, I know. There's bound to be a mob of blokes after her, like young Richard Edmondson. I hear he's very well placed." "That's right," Tristan said. "Old friends of the family, big farmers rolling in brass. I understand old man Alderson fancies Richard strongly as a son-in-law." I dug my hands into my pockets. "Can't blame him. A ragged-arsed young vet isn't much competition." "Well, don't be gloomy, old lad. You've made a bit of progress, haven't you?" "Well, in a way," I said with a wry smile. "I've taken her out twice. To a dinner dance which wasn't on, and to a cinema showing the wrong film. A dead loss the first time and not much better the second. I just don't seem to have any luck there. Something goes wrong every time. Maybe this invitation is just a polite gesture, returning hospitality or something like that." "Nonsense!" Tristan laughed and patted me on the shoulder. "This is the beginning of better things. You'll see. Nothing'll go wrong this time." And on Sunday afternoon, as I got out of the car to open the gate to Heston Grange, it did seem as if all was right with the world. The rough track snaked down from the gate through the fields to Helen's home, slumbering in the sunshine by the curving river, and the grey-stoned old building was like a restful haven against the stark backcloth of the fells beyond. I leaned on the gate for a moment, breathing in the sweet air. There had been a change during the last week. The harsh winds had dropped. Everything had softened and greened, and the warming land gave off its scents. On the lower slopes of the fell, in the shade of the pine woods, a pale mist of bluebells drifted among the dead bronze of the bracken, and their fragrance came up to me on the breeze. I drove down the track among the cows, relishing the tender young grass after their long winter in the byres, and as I knocked on the farmhouse door, I felt a surge of optimism and well-being. Helen's younger sister answered, and it wasn't until I walked into the big flagged kitchen that I experienced a qualm. Maybe it was because it was so like that first disastrous time I had called for Helen. Mr. Alderson was there by the fireside, deep in the farmer and stock breeder as before, while above his head the cows in the vast oil painting still paddled in the lake of startling blue under the shattered peaks. On the whitewashed wall the clock still tick-tocked inexorably. Helen's father looked up over his spectacles just as he had done before. "Good afternoon, you man. Come and sit down." As I dropped into the chair opposite him, he looked at me uncertainly for a few seconds. "It's a better day," he murmured. Then his eyes were drawn back irresistibly to the pages on his knee. As he bent his head and started to read again, I gained the strong impression that he hadn't the slightest idea who I was. It came back to me forcibly that there was a big difference in coming to a farm as a vet and visiting socially. I was often in farm kitchens on my rounds, washing my hands in the sink after kicking my boots off in the porch, chatting effortlessly to the farmer's wife about the sick beast. But here I was in my good suit, sitting stiffly across from a silent little man whose daughter I had come to court. It wasn't the same at all. I was relieved when Helen came in carrying a cake, which she placed on the big table. This wasn't easy, as the table was already loaded. ham and egg pies rubbing shoulders with snowy scones, a pickled tongue, cheek by jowl with a bowl of mixed salad, luscious-looking custard tarts jockeying for position with sausage rolls, tomato sandwiches, fairy cakes. In a clearing near the centre, a vast trifle reared its cream-topped head. It was a real Yorkshire tea. Helen came over to me. "Hello, Jim. Nice to see you. You're quite a stranger." She smiled her slow, friendly smile. "Hello, Helen. Yes, you know what lambing time's like. I hope things will ease up a bit now." "Well, I hope so too. Hard work's all right up to a point, but you need a break sometime. Anyway, come and have some tea. Are you hungry?" "I am now," I said, gazing at the packed foodstuffs. Helen laughed. "Well, come and sit down. Dad, leave your precious farmer and stockbreeder and come over here." We were going to sit down in the dining room, but Dad won't have his tea anywhere but in here, so that's all about it. I took my place along with Helen, young Tommy and Mary, her brother and sister, and Auntie Lucy, Mr. Alderson's widowed sister, who had recently come to live with the family. Mr. Alderson groaned his way over the flags, collapsed on the high-backed wooden chair, and began to saw phlegmatically at the tongue. As I accepted my laden plate, I can't say I felt entirely at ease. In the course of my work, I'd eaten many meals in the homes of the hospitable Dalesmen, and I had discovered that light chatter was not welcomed at table. The accepted thing, particularly among the more old-fashioned types, was to put the food away in silence and get back on the job. But maybe this was different. Sunday tea might be a more social occasion. I looked round the table, waiting for somebody to lead the way. Helen spoke up. "Jim's had a busy time among the sheep since we last saw him." "Oh, yes." Aunt Lucy put her head on one side and smiled. She was a little bird-like woman, very like her brother, and the way she looked at me made me feel she was on my side. The young people regarded me fixedly with twitching mouths. The only other time I'd met them, they had found me an object of some amusement, and things didn't seem to have changed. Mr. Alderson sprinkled some salt on a radish, conveyed it to his mouth, and crunched it impassively. "Did you have much twin-lamb disease this time, Jim?" Helen asked, trying again. "Oh, quite a bit," I replied brightly. "Haven't had much luck with treatment, though. I tried dosing the ewes with glucose this year, and I think it did a bit of good." Mr. Alderson swallowed the last of his radish. "I think nowt to glucose," he grunted. "I've had a go with it, and I think nowt to it." "Really?" I said. "Well, now that's interesting. Yes, quite." I buried myself in my salad for a spell before offering a further contribution. "There's been a lot of sudden deaths in the lambs," I said. "Seems to be more pulpy kidney about." "Fancy that," said Aunt Lucy, smiling encouragingly. "Yes," I went on, getting into my stride. "It's a good job we've got a vaccine against it now." "Wonderful things, these vaccines," Helen chipped in. "You'll soon be able to prevent a lot of sheep disease that way." The conversation was warming up. Mr. Alderson finished his tongue and pushed his plate away. "I think nowt to the vaccines. And those sudden deaths you're on about, they're caused by wool ball in stomach. They're nowt to do with the kidneys." "Oh, yes, well, wool ball, eh? Ah, yes, wool ball." I subsided and decided to concentrate on the food. And it was worth concentrating on. As I worked my way through, I was aware of a growing sense of wonder that Helen had probably baked the entire spread. It was when my teeth were sinking into a poem of a curd tart that I really began to appreciate the miracle that somebody of Helen's radiant attractiveness should be capable of this. I looked across at her. She was a big girl, nothing like her little wisp of a father. She must have taken after her mother. Mrs. Alderson had been dead for many years, and I wondered if she'd had the same wide, generous mouth that smiled so easily. Those same warm blue eyes under the soft mass of black-brown hair. A spluttering from Tommy and Mary showed that they had been appreciatively observing me gawping at their sister. "That's enough, you two," Auntie Lucy reproved. "Anyway, you can go now. We're going to clear the table." Helen and she began to move the dishes to the scullery beyond the door, while Mr. Alderson and I returned to our chairs by the fireside. The little man ushered me to mine with a vague wave of his hand. "Here, take a seat here, young man." A clattering issued from the kitchen as the washing-up began. We were alone. Mr. Alderson's hand strayed automatically towards his farmer and stockbreeder, but he withdrew it after a single hunted glance in my direction and began to drum his fingers on the arm of the chair, whistling softly under his breath. I groped desperately for an opening gambit, but came up with nothing. The ticking of the clock boomed out into the silence. I was beginning to break out into a sweat when the little man cleared his throat. "Pigs were a good trade on Monday," he vouchsafed. "They were, eh? Oh, well, that's fine. Jolly good." Mr. Alderson nodded, fixed his gaze somewhere above my left shoulder, and started drumming his fingers again. Once more the heavy silence blanketed us, and the clock continued to hammer out its message. After several years, Mr. Alderson stirred in his seat and gave a little cough. I looked at him eagerly. "Store cattle were down, though," he said. Oh, too bad. What a pity," I babbled. But that's how it is, I suppose. That's how it goes, eh?" Helen's father shrugged, and we settled down again. This time I knew it was hopeless. My mind was a void, and my companion had the defeated look of a man who had shot his conversational bolt. I lay back and studied the hams and sides of bacon hanging from their hooks in the ceiling. Then I worked my way along the row of plates on the big oak dresser to the gaudy calendar from a cattle cake firm, which dangled from a nail on the wall. I took a chance then and stole a glance at Mr. Alderson out of the corner of my eye, and my toes curled as I saw he had chosen that precise moment to have a sideways peep at me. We both looked away hurriedly. By shifting round in my seat and craning my neck, I was able to get a view of the other side of the kitchen, where there was an old-fashioned roll-top desk, surmounted by a wartime picture of Mr. Alderson looking very stern in the uniform of the Yorkshire Yeomanry, and I was proceeding along the wall from there when Helen opened the door and came quickly into the room. "Dad," she said a little breathlessly, "Stan's here. He says one of the cows is down with staggers." Her father jumped up in obvious relief. I think he was delighted to have a sick cow, and I too felt like a released prisoner as I hurried out after him. Stan, one of the cowmen, was waiting in the yard. "She's at top of field, boss. I just spotted her when I went to get them in for milking." Mr. Alderson looked at me questioningly, and I nodded at him as I opened the car door. "I've got the staff with me," I said. "We'd better drive straight up." The three of us piled in, and I set course to where I could see the stretched-out form of a cow near the wall in the top corner. My bottles and instruments rattled and clattered as we bumped over the rig and furrow. This was something every vet gets used to in early summer. The urgent call to milk cows which have collapsed suddenly a week or two after being turned out to grass. The farmers called it grass staggers, and, as its scientific name of hypomagnesemia implied, it was associated with lowered magnesium level in the blood. An alarming and highly fatal condition, but fortunately curable by injection of magnesium in most cases. Despite the seriousness of the occasion, I couldn't repress a twinge of satisfaction. It had got me out of the house, and it gave me a chance to prove myself by doing something useful. Helen's father and I hadn't established anything like a rapport as yet, but maybe when I gave his unconscious cow my magic injection and it leapt to its feet and walked away, he might look at me in a different light. And it often happened that way. Some of the cures were really dramatic. "She's still alive, any road," Stan said as we roared over the grass. "I saw her legs move then." He was right, but as I pulled up and jumped from the car, I felt a twinge of apprehension. Those legs were moving too much. This was the kind that often died, the convulsive type. The animal, prone on her side, was pedalling frantically at the air with all 4 feet, her head stretched backwards, eyes staring, foam bubbling from her mouth. As I hurriedly unscrewed the cap from the bottle of magnesium lactate, she stopped and went into a long, shuddering spasm, legs stiffly extended, eyes screwed tightly shut. Then she relaxed and lay inert for a frightening few seconds before recommencing the wild thrashing with her legs. My mouth had gone dry. This was a bad one. The strain on the heart during these spasms was enormous, and each one could be her last. I crouched by her side, my needle poised over the milk vein. My usual practice was to inject straight into the bloodstream to achieve the quickest possible effect, but in this case I hesitated. Any interference with the heart's actions could kill this cow. Best to play safe. I reached over and pushed the needle under the skin of the neck. As the fluid ran in, bulging the subcutaneous tissues, and starting a widening swelling under the roan-coloured hide, the cow went into another spasm. For an agonizing few seconds she lay there, the quivering limbs reaching desperately out at nothing, the eyes disappearing deep down under tight, twisted lids. Helplessly I watched her, my heart thudding, and this time, as she came out of the rigger and started to move again, it wasn't with the purposeful pedalling of before. It was an aimless, laboured pawing, and as even this grew weaker, her eyes slowly opened and gazed outwards with a vacant stare. I bent and touched the cornea with my finger. There was no response. The farmer and cowman looked at me in silence as the animal gave a final jerk, then lay still. "I'm afraid she's dead, Mr. Alderson," I said. The farmer nodded and his eyes moved slowly over the still form, over the graceful limbs, the fine dark roan flanks, the big, turgid udder that would give no more milk. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm afraid her heart must have given out before the magnesium had a chance to work."
"Oh, it's a bloody shame," grunted Stan. "She was a right good cow, that one."
Mr. Alderson turned quietly back to the car.
"Ah, well, these things happen," he muttered.
We drove down the field to the house. Inside, the work was over and the family was collected in the parlour. I sat with them for a while, but my overriding emotion was an urgent desire to be elsewhere. Helen's father had been silent before, but now he sat hunched miserably in an armchair, taking no part in the conversation. I wondered whether he thought I had actually killed the cow. It certainly hadn't looked very good, the vet walking up to the sick animal, the quick injection, and hey presto, dead. No, I had been blameless, but it hadn't looked good. On an impulse, I jumped to my feet. "Thank you very much for the lovely tea," I said, "but I really must be off. I'm on duty this evening." Helen came with me to the door. "Well, it's been nice seeing you again, Jim." She paused and looked at me doubtfully. "I wish you'd stop worrying about that cow." "It's a pity, but you couldn't help it. There was nothing you could do." "Thanks, Helen, I know. But it's a nasty smack for your father, isn't it?" She shrugged and smiled her kind smile. Helen was always kind. Driving back through the pastures up to the farm gate, I could see the motionless body of my patient, with her companion sniffing around her curiously in the gentle evening sunshine. Any time now, the knacker man would be along to winch the carcass onto his wagon. It was the grim epilogue to every vet's failure. I closed the gate behind me and looked back at Heston Grange. I had thought everything would be all right this time, but it hadn't worked out that way. The jinx was still on. Chapter 8. Monday morning disease, they used to call it. The almost unbelievably gross thickening of the hind limb in cart horses, which had stood in the stable over the weekend. It seemed that the sudden suspension of their normal work and exercise produced a massive lymphangitis and swelling which gave many a farmer a nasty jolt right at the beginning of the week. But it was Wednesday evening now, and Mr. Crump's big shire gelding was greatly improved. "That leg's less than half the size it was," I said, running my hand over the inside of the hock, feeling the remains of the edema pitting under my fingers. "I can see you put in some hard work here." "Aye, I did as you said." Mr. Crump's reply was typically laconic, and I knew he must have spent hours fermenting and massaging the limb and forcibly exercising the horse as I told him when I gave the acroline injection on Monday. I began to fill the syringe for a repeat injection. "He's having no corn, is he?" "Nay, nowt but bran." "Oh, that's fine. I think he'll be back to normal in a day or two if you keep up the treatment." The farmer grunted, and no sign of approval showed in the big purple-red face, with its perpetually surprised expression. But I knew he was pleased all right. He was fond of the horse, and had been unable to hide his concern at the animal's pain and distress on my first visit. I went into the house to wash my hands, and Mr. Crump led the way into the kitchen, his big frame lumbering clumsily ahead of me. He proffered soap and towel in his slow-moving way and stood back in silence as I leant over the long, shallow sink of brown earthenware. As I dried my hands, he cleared his throat and spoke hesitatingly. "Would you like a drink of my wine?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Crump came bustling through from an inner room. She was pulling on her hat, and behind her teenage son and daughter followed, dressed ready to go out. "Oh, Albert, stop it," she snapped, looking up at her husband. "Mr. Herriot doesn't want your wine. I wish you wouldn't pester people so with it." The boy grinned.
Dad and his wine. He's always looking for a victim.
His sister joined in the general laughter, and I had an uncomfortable feeling that Mr. Crump was the odd man out in his own home.
We're going down to Village Institute to see a school play, Mr. Herriot, the wife said briskly. We're late now, so we must be off.
She hurried away with her children, leaving the big man looking after her sheepishly. There was a silence while I finished drying my hands. Then I turned to the farmer. "Well, how about that drink, Mr. Crump?" He hesitated for a moment, and the surprised look deepened.
Would you really like to try some?"
"I'd love to. I haven't had my evening meal yet. I could just do with an aperitif."
"Right. I'll be back in a minute."
He disappeared into the large pantry at the end of the kitchen and came back with a bottle of amber liquid and glasses.
"This is my rhubarb,"
he said, tipping out 2 good measures. I took a sip and then a good swallow, and gasped as the liquid blazed a fiery trail down to my stomach.
"Oh, it's strong stuff,"
I said a little breathlessly. "But the taste is very pleasant." "Very pleasant indeed." Mr. Crump watched approvingly as I took another drink.
"Aye, it's just right. Nearly 2 years old."
I drained the glass, and this time the wine didn't burn so much on its way down, but seemed to wash around the walls of my empty stomach and send glowing tendrils creeping along my limbs. "Delicious," I said. "Absolutely delicious." The farmer expanded visibly. He refilled the glass and watched with rapt attention as I drank. When we had finished the second glass, he jumped to his feet.
"Now for a change, I want you to try something different."
He almost trotted to the pantry and produced another bottle, this time of colourless liquid.
"Elderflower,"
he said, panting slightly. When I tasted it, I was amazed at the delicate flavour, the bubbles sparkling and dancing on my tongue.
"Gosh, this is terrific. It's just like champagne. You know, you really have a gift.
I never thought homemade wines could taste like this." Mr. Crump stared at me for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth began to twitch, and incredibly a shy smile spread slowly over his face.
"You're the first I've heard say that. You'd think I was trying to poison folk when I offer them me wine. They always shy off, but they can sup plenty of beer and whiskey."
"Well, they don't know what they're missing, Mr. Crump." I watched while the farmer replenished my glass. "I wouldn't have believed you could make stuff as good as this at home." I sipped appreciatively at the elderflower. It still tasted like champagne. I hadn't got more than halfway down the glass before Mr. Crump was clattering and clinking inside the pantry again. He emerged with a bottle with contents of deep red blood.
"Try this,"
he gasped. I was beginning to feel like a professional taster, and rolled the first mouthful round my mouth with eyes half closed.
Yes.
Just like an excellent port. But there's something else here, a fruitiness in the background. Something familiar about its
"Blackberry,"
shouted Mr. Crump triumphantly.
"One of the best I've done.
Made it 2 back ends since.
It was a right good year for it."
Leaning back in the chair, I took another drink of the rich, dark wine. It was round-flavoured, warming, and behind it there was always the elusive hint of the brambles. I could almost see the heavy-hanging clusters of berries glistening black and succulent in the autumn sunshine. The mellowness of the image matched my mood, which was becoming more expansive by the minute. And I looked round with leisurely appreciation at the rough comfort of the farmhouse kitchen, at the hams and sides of bacon hanging from their hooks in the ceiling, and at my host sitting across the table watching me eagerly. He was, I noticed for the first time, still wearing his cap. "You know," I said, holding the glass high and studying its ruby depths against the light, "I can't make up my mind which of your wines I like best. They're all excellent, and yet so different." Mr. Crump, too, had relaxed. He threw back his head and laughed delightedly before hurriedly refilling both of our tumblers.
"But you haven't started yet. I've got dozens of bottles in there, all different. You must try a few more." He shambled again over to the pantry, and this time when he reappeared he was weighed down by an armful of bottles of different shapes and colours. What a charming man he was, I thought. How wrong I'd been in my previous assessment of him. It had been so easy to put him down as lumpish and unemotional, but as I looked at him now, his face was alight with friendship, hospitality, understanding. He had cast off his inhibitions, and as he sat down, surrounded by the latest batch, he began to talk rapidly and fluently about the wines and wine-making. Wide-eyed and impassioned, he ranged at length over the niceties of fermentation and sedimentation, of flavour and bouquet. He dealt learnedly with the relative merits of Chambertin and Louis Saint-Georges, Montrachet and Chablis. Enthusiasts are appealing, but a fanatic is irresistible, and I sat spellbound while Mr. Crump pushed endless samples of his craft in front of me, mixing and adjusting expertly. "How'd you find that one?" "Very nice." "But sweet, maybe?" "Well, perhaps." "Right. Try some of this with it." The meticulous addition of a few drops of nameless liquid from the packed row of bottles. "How's that?" "Marvellous. Now this one. Perhaps a bit sharpish, eh?" "Possibly, yes." Again the tender trickling of a few mysterious droplets into my drink, and again the anxious inquiry. "Is that better?" "Just right." The big man drank with me glass by glass. We tried parsnip and dandelion, cowslip and parsley, clover, gooseberry, beetroot and crabapple. Incredibly, we had some stuff made from turnips, which was so exquisite that I insisted on a refill. Everything gradually slowed down as we sat there. Time slowed down till it was finally meaningless. Mr. Crump and I slowed down, and our speech and actions became more and more deliberate. The farmer's visits to the pantry developed into laboured, unsteady affairs. Sometimes he took a roundabout route to reach the door, and on one occasion there was a tremendous crash from within, and I feared he had fallen among his bottles. But I couldn't be bothered to get up to see, and in due course he reappeared, apparently unharmed. It was around 9 o'clock that I heard the soft knocking on the outer door. I ignored it as I didn't want to interrupt Mr. Crump, who was in the middle of a deep exposition. "This," he was saying, leaning closer to me and tapping a bulbous flagon with his forefinger. "This is, in my opinion, comparable to a fine Moselle. Made it last year, and would appreciate it if you'd tell me what you think." He bent low over the glass, blinking, heavy-eyed as he poured. "Now then, what do you say? Is it, or isn't it?" I took a gulp and paused for a moment. It all tasted the same now, and I had never drunk Moselle anyway, but I nodded and hiccuped solemnly in reply. The farmer rested a friendly hand on my shoulder and was about to make a further speech when he too heard the knocking. He made his way across the floor with some difficulty and opened the door. A young lad was standing there, and I heard a few muttered words. "We have a cow on calving, and we phoned surgery, and they said veterinary might still be here." Mr. Crump turned to face me. "It's the Bamfords of Holly Bush. They want you to go there. Just a mile along the road." "Right." I heaved myself to my feet, then gripped the table tightly as the familiar objects of the room began to whirl rapidly around me. When they came to rest, Mr. Crump appeared to be standing at the head of a fairly steep slope. The kitchen floor had seemed perfectly level when I'd come in, but now it was all I could do to fight my way up the gradient. When I reached the door, Mr. Crump was staring owlishly into the darkness. "Swimming," he said. "Swimming like hell." I peered out at the steady beat of the dark water on the cobbles of the yard. But my car was just a few yards away, and I was about to set out when the farmer caught my arm. "Just a minute. You can't go out like that." He held up a finger and went over and groped about in a drawer. At length he produced a tweed cap, which he offered me with great dignity. I never wore anything on my head, whatever the weather, but I was deeply touched,
and wrung my companion's hand in silence. It was understandable that a man like Mr. Crump, who wore his cap at all times, indoors and out, would recoil in horror from the idea of anybody venturing uncovered into rain. The tweed cap which I now put on was the biggest I'd ever seen. A great, round, flat pancake of a thing, which even at that moment I felt would keep not only my head, but my shoulders and entire body dry in the heaviest downpour. I took my leave of Mr. Crump with reluctance, and as I settled in the seat of the car, trying to remember where first gear was situated, I could see his bulky form silhouetted against the light from the kitchen. He was waving his hand with gentle benevolence, and it struck me as I at length drove away what a deep and wonderful friendship had been forged that night. Driving at walking pace along the dark, narrow road, my nose almost touching the windscreen, I was conscious of some unusual sensations. My mouth and lips felt abnormally sticky, as though I had been drinking liquid glue instead of wine. My breath seemed to be whistling in my nostrils like a strong wind blowing under a door, and I was having difficulty focusing my eyes. Fortunately, I met only one car, and as it approached and flashed past in the other direction, I was muzzily surprised by the fact that it had two complete sets of headlights, which kept merging into each other and drawing apart again. In the yard at Hollybush, I got out of the car, nodded to the shadowy group of figures standing there, fumbled my bottle of antiseptic and carving ropes from the boot, and marched determinedly into the byre. One of the men held an oil lamp over a cow lying on a deep bed of straw in one of the standings. From the vulva a calf's foot protruded a few inches, and as the cow strained, a little muzzle showed momentarily, then disappeared as she relaxed. Far away inside me, a stone, cold-sober veterinary surgeon murmured, "Only a leg back and a big roomy cow. Shouldn't be much trouble." I turned and looked at the Bamfords for the first time. I hadn't met them before, but it was easy to classify them. Simple, kindly, anxious to please people. 2 middle-aged men, probably brothers, and 2 young men who would be the sons of one or the other. They were all staring at me in the dim light, their eyes expectant, their mouths slightly open as though ready to smile or laugh if given half a chance. I squared my shoulders, took a deep breath, and said in a loud voice, "Would you please bring me a bucket of hot water, soap, and a towel?" Or at least, that's what I meant to say, because what actually issued from my lips was a torrent of something that sounded like Swahili. The Bamfords, poised, ready to spring into action to do my bidding, looked at me blankly. I cleared my throat, swallowed, took a few seconds' rest, and tried again. I cleared my throat, swallowed, another volley of gibberish echoing uselessly round the cowhouse. Clearly, I had a problem. It was essential to communicate in some way, particularly since these people didn't know me and were waiting for some action. I suppose I must have appeared a strange and enigmatic figure, standing there straight and solemn, surmounted and dominated by a vast cap. But through the mists a flash of insight showed me where I was going wrong. It was overconfidence. It wasn't a bit of good trying to speak loudly like that. I tried again, in the faintest of whispers. "Could I have a bucket of hot water, some soap, and a towel, please?" It came out beautifully, though the oldest Mr. Bamford didn't quite get it first time. He came close, cupped an ear with his hand, and watched my lips intently. Then he nodded eagerly in comprehension, held up a forefinger at me, tiptoed across the floor like a tightrope walker to one of the sons, and whispered in his ear. The young man turned and crept out noiselessly, closing the door behind him with the utmost care. He was back in less than a minute, padding over the cobbles daintily in his heavy boots and placing the bucket gingerly in front of me. I managed to remove my jacket, tie and shirt quite efficiently, and they were taken from me in silence and hung upon nails by the Bamfords, who were moving around as though in church. I thought I was doing fine till I started to wash my arms. The soap kept shooting from my arms, slithering into the dung channel, disappearing into the dark corners of the bar with the Bamfords in hot pursuit. It was worse still when I tried to work up to the top of my arms. The soap flew over my shoulders like a live thing, at times cannoning off the walls, at others gliding down my back. The farmers never knew where the next shot was going, and they took on the appearance of a really sharp fielding side, crouching around me with arms outstretched, waiting for a catch. However, I did finally work up a lather and was ready to start, but the cow refused firmly to get to her feet. So I had to stretch out behind her, face down on the unyielding cobbles. It wasn't till I got down there that I felt the great cap dropping over my ears. I must have put it on again after removing my shirt, though it was difficult to see what purpose it might serve. Inserting a hand gently into the vagina, I pushed along the calf's neck, hoping to come upon a flexed knee or even a foot, but I was disappointed. The leg really was right back, stretching from the shoulder away flat against the calf's side. Still, I would be all right. It just meant a longer reach. And there was one reassuring feature. The calf was alive. As I lay, my face was almost touching the rear end of the cow, and I had a close-up of the nose which kept appearing every few seconds. It was good to see the little nostrils twitching as they sought the air outside. All I had to do was get that leg round. But the snack was that as I reached forward, the cow kept straining, squeezing my arm cruelly against her bony pelvis, making me groan and roll about in agony for a few seconds till the pressure went off. Quite often in these crises my cap fell onto the floor, and each time gentle hands replaced it immediately on my head. At last the foot was in my hand. There would be no need for ropes this time, and I began to pull it round. It took me longer than I thought, and it seemed to me that the calf was beginning to lose patience with me, because when its head was forced out by the cow's contractions, we were eye to eye, and I fancied the little creature was giving me a disgusted, "For heaven's sake, get on with it," look. When the leg did come round, it was with a rush, and in an instant everything was laid as it should have been. "Get hold of the feet," I whispered to the Bamfords, and after a hushed consultation they took up their places. In no time at all, a fine heifer calf was wriggling on the cobbles, shaking its head, and snorting the placental fluid from its nostrils. In response to my softly hissed instructions, the farmers rubbed the little creature down with straw wisps and pulled it round for its mother to lick. It was a happy ending to the most peaceful carving I have ever attended. Never a voice raised, everybody moving around on tiptoe. I got dressed in a cathedral silence, went out to the car, breathed a final good night, and left with the Bamfords waving mutely. To say I had a hangover next morning would be failing even to hint at the utter disintegration of my bodily economy and personality. Only somebody who had consumed 2 or 3 quarts of assorted homemade wines at a sitting could have an inkling of the quaking nausea, the raging inferno within, the jangling nerves, the black, despairing outlook. Tristan had seen me in the bathroom running the cold tap on my tongue and had intuitively administered a raw egg, aspirins and brandy, which, as I came downstairs, lay in a cold, unmoving blob in my outraged stomach. "What are you walking like that for, James?" asked Siegfried in what sounded like a bull's bellow as I came in on him at breakfast. "You look as though you peed yourself." "Oh, it's nothing much." It was no good telling him that I was treading warily across the carpet because I was convinced that if I let my heels down too suddenly, it would jar my eyeballs from their sockets. "I had a few glasses of Mr. Crump's wine last night, and it seems to have upset me." "A few glasses? You've got to be more careful. That stuff's dynamite. Could knock anybody over." He crashed his cup into its saucer, then began to clatter about with knife and fork, as if trying to give a one-man rendering of the Anvil chorus. "I hope you weren't any the worse to go to the Bamfords." I listlessly crumbled some dry toast on my plate. "Well, I did the job all right. But I'd had a bit too much. No use denying it." Siegfried was in one of his encouraging moods.
By God, James, those Bamfords are very strict Methodists. Look, they're grand chaps, but absolutely dead nuts against drink. If they thought you were under the influence of alcohol, they'd never have you on the place again. He ruthlessly bisected an egg yolk. I hope they didn't notice anything. Do you think they knew? Oh, maybe not. No, I shouldn't think so. I closed my eyes and shivered as Siegfried pushed a forkful of sausage and fried bread into his mouth and began to chew, briskly. My mind went back to the gentle hands replacing the monstrous cap on my head, and I groaned inwardly. Those Bamfords knew all right. Oh, yes, they knew.
Chapter 9.
The silvery-haired old gentleman with the pleasant face didn't look the type to be easily upset, but his eyes glared at me angrily and his lips quivered with indignation. "Mr. Herriot," he said, "I have come to make a complaint. I strongly object to your callousness in subjecting my dog to unnecessary suffering." "Suffering? What suffering?" I was mystified. "I think you know, Mr. Herriot. I brought my dog in a few days ago. He was very lame, and I am referring to your treatment on that occasion." I nodded. Yes, I remember it well, but where does the suffering come in? "Well, the poor animal is going round with his leg dangling, and I have it on good authority that the bone is fractured and should have been put in plaster immediately." The old gentleman stuck his chin out fiercely. "Yes, all right, you can stop worrying," I said. "Your dog has a radial paralysis caused by a blow on the ribs, and if you're patient and follow my treatment, he'll gradually improve. In fact, I think he'll recover completely." "But he trails his leg when he walks." "I know. That's typical, and to the layman it does give the appearance of a broken leg. But he shows no sign of pain, does he?" "No. He seems quite happy, but this lady seemed to be absolutely sure of her facts. She was adamant." "Lady?" "Yes," said the old gentleman. "She is very clever with animals, and she came round to see if she could help in my dog's convalescence. She brought some excellent condition powders with her." "Ah!" A blinding shaft pierced the fog in my mind. All was suddenly clear. It was Mrs. Donovan, wasn't it? "Well, yes, that was her name." Old Mrs. Donovan was a woman who really got around. No matter what was going on in Darrowby, weddings, funerals, house sales, you'd find the dumpy little figure and walnut face among the spectators, the darting, black-button eyes taking everything in, and always on the end of its lead, her terrier dog. When I say old, I'm only guessing because she appeared ageless. She seemed to have been around a long time, but she could have been anything between 55 and 75. She certainly had the vitality of a young woman because she must have walked vast distances in her dedicated quest to keep abreast of events. Many people took an uncharitable view of her acute curiosity. But whatever the motivation, her activities took her into almost every channel of life in the town. One of those channels was our veterinary practice. Because Mrs. Donovan, among her other widely ranging interests, was an animal doctor. In fact, I think it would be safe to say that this facet of her life transcended all the others. She could talk at length on the ailments of small animals, and she had a whole armoury of medicines and remedies at her command, her two specialities being her miracle-working condition powders and a dog shampoo of unprecedented value for improving the coat. She had an uncanny ability to sniff out a sick animal, and it was not uncommon when I was on my rounds to find Mrs. Donovan's dark, gypsy face poised intently over what I thought was my patient while she administered calf's foot jelly or one of her own patent nostrums. I suffered more than Siegfried because I took a more active part in the small animal side of our practice. I was anxious to develop this aspect and to improve my image in this field, and Mrs. Donovan didn't help at all. "Young Mr. Herriot," she would confide to my clients, "is all right with cattle and such like, but he don't know nothing about dogs and cats." And of course they believed her and had implicit faith in her. She had the irresistible mystic appeal of the amateur, and on top of that, there was her habit, particularly endearing in Darrowby, of never charging for her advice, her medicines,
her long periods of diligent nursing. Older folk in the town told how her husband, an Irish farm worker, had died many years ago, and how he must have had a bit put away, because Mrs. Donovan had apparently been able to indulge all her interests over the years without financial strain. Since she inhabited the streets of Darrowby all day and every day, I often encountered her, and she always smiled up at me sweetly and told me how she had been sitting up all night with Mrs. So-and-so's dog that I'd been treating. She felt sure she'd be able to pull it through. There was no smile on her face, however, on the day when she rushed into the surgery while Siegfried and I were having tea.
"Mr. Herriot, can you come? My little dog's been run over."
I jumped up and ran out to the car with her. She sat in the passenger seat with her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly on her knees.
"He slipped his collar and ran in front of a car," she murmured. "He's lying in front of the school halfway up Clough End Road. Please hurry."
I was there within 3 minutes, but as I bent over the dusty little body stretched on the pavement, I knew there was nothing I could do. The fast glazing eyes, the faint, gasping respirations, the ghastly pallor of the mucous membranes all told the same story. "I'll take him back to the surgery and get some saline into him, Mrs. Donovan. But I'm afraid he's had a massive internal hemorrhage. Did you see what happened exactly?" She gulped.
"Yes. The wheel went right over him."
Ruptured liver for sure. I passed my hands under the little animal and began to lift him gently. But as I did so, the breathing stopped and the eyes stared fixedly ahead. Mrs. Donovan sank to her knees, and for a few moments she gently stroked the rough hair of the head and chest.
"He's dead, isn't he?"
she whispered at last. "I'm afraid he is," I said. She got slowly to her feet and stood bewilderedly among the little group of bystanders on the pavement. Her lips moved, but she seemed unable to say any more. I took her arm, led her over to the car and opened the door. "Get in and sit down. I'll run you home. Leave everything to me." I wrapped the dog in my carving overall and laid him in the boot before driving away. It wasn't until we drew up outside Mrs. Donovan's house that she began to weep silently. I sat there without speaking till she'd finished. Then she wiped her eyes and turned to me.
"Do you think he suffered at all?"
"I'm certain he didn't. It was all so quick. He wouldn't know a thing about it." She tried to smile.
"Poor little Rex. I don't know what I'm going to do without him. We've travelled a few miles together, you know."
"Yes, you have. He had a wonderful life, Mrs. Donovan. And let me give you a bit of advice. You must get another dog. You'd be lost without one." She shook her head.
"No, I couldn't. That little dog meant too much to me. I couldn't let another take his place."
"Well, I know that's how you feel just now, but I wish you'd think about it. I don't want to seem callous. I tell everybody this when they lose an animal, and I know it's good advice."
"Mr. Herriot, I'll never have another one."
She shook her head again, very decisively.
"Rex was my faithful friend for many years, and I just want to remember him. He's the last dog I'll ever have."
I often saw Mrs. Donovan around the town after this, and I was glad to see she was still as active as ever, though she looked strangely incomplete without the little dog on its lead. But it must have been over a month before I had the chance to speak to her. It was on the afternoon that Inspector Halliday of the RSPCA rang me.
"Mr. Herriot, I'd like you to come to see an animal with me. A cruelty case."
"Oh, right. What is it?"
"A dog, and it's pretty grim. A dreadful case of neglect."
He gave me the name of a row of old brick cottages down by the river and said he'd meet me there. Halliday was waiting for me, smart and businesslike, in his dark uniform, as I pulled up in the back lane behind the houses. He was a big, blond man with cheerful blue eyes, but he didn't smile as he came over to the car.
"He's in here,"
he said, and led the way towards one of the doors in the long, crumbling wall. A few curious people were hanging around, and with a feeling of inevitability, I recognised a gnome-like brown face. Trust Mrs. Donovan, I thought, to be among those present at a time like this. We went through the door into the long garden. I had found that even the lowliest dwellings in Darrowby had long strips of land at the back, as though the builders had taken it for granted that the country people who were going to live in them would want to occupy themselves with the pursuits of the soil, with vegetable and fruit growing, even stock-keeping in a small way. You usually found a pig there, a few hens, often pretty beds of flowers, but this garden was a wilderness. A chilling air of desolation hung over the few gnarled apple and plum trees standing among the tangle of rank grass, as though the place had been forsaken by all living creatures. Halliday went over to a ramshackle wooden shed with peeling paint and a rusted corrugated iron roof. He produced a key, unlocked the padlock, and dragged the door partly open. There was no window, and it wasn't easy to identify the jumble inside. Broken gardening tools, an ancient mangle, rows of flower pots and partly used paint tins. And right at the back, a dog sitting quietly. I didn't notice him immediately, because of the gloom, and because the smell in the shed started me coughing. But as I drew closer, I saw that he was a big animal, sitting very upright, his collar secured by a chain to a ring in the wall. I had seen some thin dogs, but this advanced emaciation reminded me of my textbooks on anatomy. Nowhere else did the bones of pelvis, face, and ribcage stand out with such horrifying clarity. A deep, smoothed-out hollow in the earth floor showed where he had lain, moved about, in fact, lived for a very long time. The sight of the animal had a stupefying effect on me. I only half took in the rest of the scene, the filthy shreds of sacking scattered nearby, the bowl of scummy water. "Look at his back end," Halliday muttered. I carefully raised the dog from his sitting position and realised that the stench in the place was not entirely due to the piles of excrement. The hindquarters were a welter of pressure sores, which had turned gangrenous, and strips of sloughing tissue hung down from them. There were similar sores along the sternum and ribs. The coat, which seemed to be a dull yellow, was matted and caked with dirt. The inspector spoke again. "I don't think he's ever been out of here. He's only a young dog, about a year old, but I understand he's been in this shed since he was an 8-week-old pup. Somebody out in the lane heard a whimper, or he'd never have been found." I felt a tightening of the throat and a sudden nausea which wasn't due to the smell. It was the thought of this patient animal sitting starved and forgotten in the darkness and filth for a year. I looked again at the dog and saw in his eyes only a calm trust. Some dogs would have barked their heads off and soon been discovered. Some would have become terrified and vicious. But this was one of the totally undemanding kind. The kind which had complete faith in people and accepted all their actions without complaint. Just an occasional whimper, perhaps, as he sat interminably in the empty blackness, which had been his world, and at times wondered what it was all about. "Well, Inspector, I hope you're going to throw the book at whoever's responsible," I said. Halliday grunted. "No, there won't be much done. It's a case of diminished responsibility. The owner's definitely simple, lives with an aged mother who hardly knows what's going on either. I've seen the fellow, and it seems he threw in a bit of food when he felt like it, and that's about all he did. They'll fine him and stop him keeping an animal in the future, but nothing more than that." "I see." I reached out and stroked the dog's head, and he immediately responded by resting a paw on my wrist. There was a pathetic dignity about the way he held himself erect, the calm eyes regarding me, friendly and unafraid. "Well, you'll let me know if you want me in court." "Of course. And thank you for coming along." Halliday hesitated for a moment. "And now I expect you'll want to put this poor thing out of his misery right away." I continued to run my hand over the head and ears while I thought for a moment. "Well, yes, I suppose so. We'd never find a home for him in this state. It's the kindest thing to do. Anyway, push the door open wide, will you, so that I can get a proper look at him?" In the improved light, I examined him more thoroughly. Perfect teeth, well-proportioned limbs with a fringe of yellow hair. I put my stethoscope to his chest, and as I listened to the slow, strong thudding of the heart, the dog again put his paw on my hand. I turned to Halliday.
You know, Inspector, inside this bag of bones is a lovely, healthy golden retriever. I wish there was some way of letting him out. As I spoke, I noticed there was more than one figure in the door opening. A pair of black pebble eyes were peering intently at the big dog from behind the inspector's broad back. The other spectators had remained in the lane, but Mrs. Donovan's curiosity had been too much for her. I continued conversationally as though I hadn't seen her. You know, what this dog needs first of all is a good shampoo to clean up his matted coat. Huh? Said Halliday. Yes. And then he wants a long course of some really strong condition powders. What's that? The inspector looked startled. No, there's no doubt about it. It's the only hope for him. But where are you going to find such things? Really powerful enough, I mean. I sighed and straightened up. Oh, well, I suppose there's nothing else for it. I'd better put him to sleep right away. I'll get the things from my car. A measureless peace. When I look back at the time before she was my wife, it was an uncertain world, and events like the Darrowby show seemed an eternity ago. I remembered when Siegfried first asked me about it. How would you like to officiate at Darrowby show, James? Siegfried threw the letter he'd been reading onto the desk and turned to me. Well, I don't mind, but I thought you always did it. I do, but it says in that letter that they've changed the date this year, and it happens I'm going to be away that weekend. Oh, well, fine. What do I have to do? Siegfried ran his eye down his list of calls. Well, it's a sinecure, really. More a pleasant day out than anything else. You have to measure the ponies and be on call in case any animals are injured. That's about it, really. Oh, and they want you to judge the family pets. Family pets? Yes, they run a proper dog show, but they have an expert judge for that. This is just a bit of fun, all kinds of pets. You've got to find a first, second, and third. Right, I said. I think I should just about be able to manage that. Splendid! Siegfried tipped up the envelope in which the letter had come. Here are your car park and luncheon tickets for self and friend if you want to take somebody with you. Also your vet's badge, OK? The Saturday of the show brought the kind of weather that must have had the organisers purring with pleasure. A sky of wide, unsullied blue, hardly a whiff of wind, and the kind of torrid, brazen sunshine you don't often find in North Yorkshire. As I drove down towards the showground, I felt I was looking at a living, breathing piece of old England. The group of tents and marquees vivid against the green of the riverside field, the women and children in their bright summer dresses, the cattle with their smocked attendants, a line of massive shire horses parading in the ring. I parked the car and made for the steward's tent, with its flag hanging limply from the mast. Tristan parted from me there. With the impecunious student's unerring eye for a little free food and entertainment, he had taken up my spare tickets. He headed purposely for the beer tent as I went in to report to the show secretary. Leaving my measuring stick there, I looked around for a while. A country show is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Riding horses of all kinds, from small ponies to hunters, were being galloped up and down, and in one ring the judges hovered around a group of mares and their beautiful little foals. In a corner, 4 men armed with buckets and brushes were washing and grooming a row of young bulls with great concentration, twiddling and crimping the fuzz over the rumps like society hairdressers. Wandering through the marquees, I examined the bewildering variety of produce, from stalks of rhubarb to bunches of onions, the flower displays, embroidery, jams, cakes, pies, and the children's section. A painting of The Beach at Scarborough by Annie Hazeltine, aged 9, rows of wobbling copperplate handwriting. A Thing of Beauty is a Joy Forever. Bernard Peacock, aged 12. Drawn by the occasional gusts of melody, I strolled across the grass to where the Darrowby and Hulton Silver Band was rendering Poet and Peasant. The bandsmen were all ages, from 70s down to 1 or 2 boys of about 14, and most of them had doffed their uniform tunics as they sweated in the hot sun. Pint pots reposed under many of the chairs, and the musicians refreshed themselves frequently with leisurely swigs. I was particularly fascinated by the conductor, a tiny, frail man who looked about 80. He alone had retained his full uniform, cap and all, and he stood apparently motionless in front of the crescent of bandsmen, chin sunk on chest, arms hanging limply by his sides.
It wasn't until I came right up to him that I realized his fingers were twitching in time with the music, and that he was, in fact, conducting. And the more I watched him, the more fitting it seemed that he should do it like that. The Yorkshireman's loathing of exhibitionism, or indeed any outward show of emotion, made it unthinkable that he should throw his arms about in the orthodox manner. No doubt he had spent weary hours rehearsing and coaching his players, but here, when the results of his labours were displayed to the public, he wasn't going to swank about it. Even the almost imperceptible twitching of the fingers had something guilty about it, as if the old man felt he was being caught out in something shameful. But my attention was jerked away as a group of people walked across on the far side of the band. It was Helen with Richard Edmondson, and behind them Mr. Alderson and Richard's father deep in conversation. The young man walked very close to Helen, his shining, plastered-down fair hair hovering possessively over her dark head, his face animated as he talked and laughed. There were no clouds in the sky, but it was as if a dark hand had reached across and smudged away the brightness of the sunshine. I turned quickly and went in search of Tristan. I soon picked out my colleague as I hurried into the marquee with refreshments over the entrance. He was leaning with an elbow on the makeshift counter of boards and trestles, chatting contentedly with a knot of cloth-capped locals, a woodbine in one hand, a pint-glass in the other. There was a general air of earthy bonhomie. Drinking of a more decorous kind would be taking place at the President's Bar behind the steward's headquarters, with pink gins or sherry as the main tipple. But here it was beer, bottled and draught, and the stout ladies behind the counter were working with the fierce concentration of people who knew they were in for a hard day. "Yes, I saw her," Tristan said when I gave him my news. "In fact, there she is now." He nodded in the direction of the family group as they strolled past the entrance. "I've had my eye on them for some time. I don't miss much from in here, you know, Jim." "Oh, well." I accepted a half a bitter from him. All looks pretty cosy. The two dads like blood brothers and Helen hanging on to that bloke's arm. Tristan squinted over the top of his pint at the scene outside and shook his head. "Not exactly. He's hanging on to her arm." He looked at me judicially. "There's a difference, you know." "I don't suppose it makes much difference to me either way," I grunted. "Well, don't look so bloody mournful." He took an effortless swallow which lowered the level in his glass by about 6 inches. "What do you expect an attractive girl to do? Sit at home waiting for you to call? If you've been pounding on her door every night, you haven't told me about it. Look, it's all right you talking. I think old man Alderson would set his dogs on me if I showed up there. I know he doesn't like me hanging around Helen, and on top of that I've got the feeling he thinks I killed his cow on my last visit." "And did you?" "No, I didn't. But I walked up to a living animal, gave it an injection, then it promptly died, so I can't blame him." I took a sip at my beer and watched the Alderson party, who had changed direction and were heading away from our retreat. Helen was wearing a pale blue dress, and I was thinking how well the colour went with the deep brown of her hair, and how I liked the way she walked with her legs swinging easily and her shoulders high and straight, when the loudspeaker boomed across the showground. "Will Mr. Herriot, veterinary surgeon, please report to the stewards immediately?" It made me jump, but at the same time I felt a quick stab of pride. It was the first time I had heard myself and my profession publicly proclaimed. I turned to Tristan. He was supposed to be seeing practice, and this could be something interesting. But he was immersed in a story which he was trying to tell to a little stocky man with a fat, shiny face, and he was having difficulty because the little man, determined to get his full measure of enjoyment, kept throwing himself into helpless convulsions at the end of every sentence, and the finish was a long, long way away. Tristan took his stories very seriously. I decided not to interrupt him. A glow of importance filled me as I hurried over the grass, my official badge with veterinary surgeon in gold letters dangling from my lapel. A steward met me on the way. "It's one of the cattle. Had an accident, I think." He pointed to a row of pens along the edge of the field. A curious crowd had collected around my patient, which had been entered in the in-calf heifers class. The owner, a stranger from outside the Darrowby practice, came up to me, his face glum. "She tripped coming off the cattle wagon and went head first into the wall. Knocked one of her horns clean off." The heifer, a bonny little light roan, was a pathetic sight. She'd been washed, combed, powdered, and primped for the big day. And there she was, with one horn dangling drunkenly down the side of her face, and an ornamental fountain of bright arterial blood climbing gracefully in 3 jets from the broken surface high into the air. I opened my bag. I had brought a selection of things I might need, and I fished out some artery forceps and suture material. The rational way to stop hemorrhage of this type is to grasp the bleeding vessel and ligate it, but it wasn't always as easy as that, especially when the patient won't cooperate. The broken horn was connected to the head only by a band of skin, and I quickly snipped it away with scissors. Then, with the farmer holding the heifer's nose, I began to probe with my forceps for the severed vessels. In the bright sunshine, it was surprisingly difficult to see the spurting blood, and as the little animal threw her head about, I repeatedly felt the warm spray across my face and heard it spatter on my collar. It was when I was beginning to lose heart with my ineffectual groping that I looked up and saw Helen and her boyfriend watching me from the crowd. Young Edmondson looked mildly amused as he watched my unavailing efforts, but Helen smiled encouragingly as she caught my eye. I did my best to smile back at her through my bloody mask, but I don't suppose it showed. I gave it up when the heifer gave a particularly brisk toss, which sent my forceps flying onto the grass. I did what I should probably have done at the beginning, clapped a pad of cotton wool and antiseptic powder onto the stump, and secured it with a figure-of-8 bandage round the other horn. "Well, that's it then," I said to the farmer as I tried to blink the blood out of my eyes. "The bleeding stopped anyway. I'd advise you to have her properly dehorned soon, or she's going to look a bit odd." Just then Tristan appeared from among the spectators. "What's got you out of the beer tent?" I inquired with a touch of bitterness. "It's lunchtime, old lad," Tristan replied equably. "But we'll have to get you cleaned up a bit first. I can't be seen with you in that condition. Hang on, I'll get a bucket of water." The show luncheon was so excellent that it greatly restored me. Although it was taken in a marquee, the committee men's wives had somehow managed to conjure up a memorable cold spread. There was fresh salmon and home-fed ham and slices of prime beef with mixed salads and apple pie, and the big, brimming jugs of cream you only see at farming functions. One of the ladies was a noted cheesemaker, and we finished with some delicious goat cheese and coffee. The liquid side was catered for too, with a bottle of Magnet Pale Ale and a glass at every place. I didn't have the pleasure of Tristan's company at lunch because he had strategically placed himself well down the table between 2 strict Methodists, so that his intake of Magnet was trebled. I had hardly emerged into the sunshine when a man touched me on the shoulder. "One of the dog show judges wants you to examine a dog. He doesn't like the look of it." He led me to where a thin man of about 40 with a small dark moustache was standing by his car. He held a wire-haired fox terrier on a leash, and he met me with an ingratiating smile. "There's nothing whatever the matter with my dog," he declared, "but the chap in there seems very fussy." I looked down at the terrier. "I see he has some matter in the corner of his eye." The man shook his head vigorously. "Oh, no, that's not matter. I've been using some white powder on him and a bit got into his eyes, that's all." "Ah. Well, let's see what his temperature says, shall we?" The little animal stood uncomplaining as I inserted the thermometer. When I took the reading, my eyebrows went up. "It's 104. I'm afraid he's not fit to go into the show." "Wait a minute." The man thrust out his jaw. "You're talking like that chap in there. I've come a long way to show this dog, and I'm going to show him." "I'm sorry, but you can't show him with a temperature of 104. "But he's had a car journey. That could put up his temperature." I shook my head. "Not as high as that, he couldn't. Anyway, he looks sick to me. Do you see how he's half closing his eyes as though he's frightened of the light? It's possible he could have distemper." "Well, that's rubbish, and you know it. He's never been fitter." The man's mouth trembled with anger. I looked down at the little dog. He was crouching on the grass miserably. Occasionally he shivered. He had a definite photophobia, and there was that creamy blob of pus in the corner of each eye. "Has he ever been inoculated against distemper?" "Well, no, he hasn't, but why do you keep on about it?" "Because I think he's got it now. And for his sake, and for the sake of the other dogs here, you ought to take him home straight away and see your own vet." He glared at me. "So you won't let me take him into the show tent?" "That's right. I'm very sorry, but it's out of the question." I turned and walked away. I had only gone a few yards when the loudspeaker boomed again. "Well, Mr. Herriot, please go to the measuring stand where the ponies are ready for him." I collected my stick and trotted over to the corner of the field where a group of ponies had assembled. Welsh, Dales, Exmoor, Dartmoor, all kinds of breeds were represented. For the uninitiated, horses are measured in hands, which consists of 4 inches, and a graduated stick is used with a crosspiece and a spirit level which rests on the withers, the highest point of the shoulders. I had done a fair bit of it on individual animals, but this was the first time I had done the job at a show. With my stick at the ready, I stood by the 2 wide boards which had been placed on the turf to give the animals a reasonably level standing surface. A smiling young woman led the first pony, a smart chestnut, onto the boards. "Which class?" I asked. 13 hands. I tried the stick on him. He was well under. "That's fine. Next, please." A few more came through without incident. Then there was a lull before the next group came up. The ponies were arriving on the field all the time in their boxes and being led over to me, some by their young riders, others by the parents. It looked as though I could be there quite a long time. During one of the lulls, a little man who had been standing nearby spoke up. "No trouble yet?" he asked. No, everything's in order," I replied. He nodded expressionlessly, and as I took a closer look at him, his slight body, dark, leathery features, and high shoulders seemed to give him the appearance of a little brown gnome. At the same time, there was something undeniably horsey about him. "You'll have some awkward ones," he grunted, "and they allus say the same thing. They allus tell you that a vet at some other show passed their pony." His swarthy cheeks crinkled in a wry smile. "Is that so?" "Aye, you'll see." Another candidate, led by a beautiful blonde, was led onto the platform. She gave me the full blast of 2 big greenish eyes and flashed a mouthful of sparkling teeth at me. 12-2, she murmured seductively. I tried the stick on the pony and worked it around, but try as I might, I couldn't get it down to that. "I'm afraid he's a bit big," I said. The blonde's smile vanished. "Have you allowed half an inch for his shoes?" "I have indeed, but you can see for yourself he's well over." "But he passed the vet without any trouble at Hickley," she snapped, and out of the corner of my eye I saw the gnome nodding sagely. "I can't help that," I said. "I'm afraid you'll have to put him in the next class." For a moment 2 green pebbles from the cold sea bed fixed me with a frigid glare. Then the blonde was gone, taking her pony with her. Next, a little bay animal was led onto the stand by a hard-faced gentleman in a check suit, and I must say I was baffled by its behaviour. Whenever the stick touched the withers, it sank at the knees, so that I couldn't be sure whether I was getting the right reading or not. Finally, I gave up and passed him through. The gnome coughed. "I know that fella." "You do?" "Aye. He's pricked that pony's withers with a pin so many times that it drops down whenever you try to measure him." "Never." "Sure as I'm standing here." I was staggered, but the arrival of another batch took up my attention for a few minutes. Some I passed, others I had to banish to another class, and the owners took it in different ways, some philosophically, a few with obvious annoyance. 1 or 2 of the ponies just didn't like the look of the stick at all, and I had to dance around them as they backed away and reared. The last pony in this group was a nice grey led by a bouncy man wearing a great big matey smile. "Oh, aye, all right?" he inquired courteously. "This end's 13-2. The animal went under the stick without trouble, but after he trotted away, the gnome spoke up again. "I know that fella too." "Really?" "Not half. Weighs down his ponies before they're measured. That grey's been standing in his box for the last hour with a 12-stone sack of corn on his back. Knocks an inch off." "Good God, you sure?" "Don't worry, I've seen him at it." My mind was beginning to reel just a little. Was the man making it all up, or were there really these malign forces at work behind all this innocent fun? "That same fella," continued the gnome, "I've seen him bring a pony to a show and get half an inch knocked off for shoes when it never had no shoes on." I wished he'd stop. And just then there was an interruption. It was the man with the moustache. He sidled up to me and whispered confidentially in my ear. "Now, I've just been thinking. My dog must have got over his journey by now, and I expect his temperature will be normal. I wonder if he'd just try him again. I've still got time to show him." I turned wearily. "Honestly, it'll be a waste of time. I've told you he's ill." "Please, just as a favour." He had a desperate look, and a fanatical light flickered in his eye. All right. I went over to the car with him and produced my thermometer. The temperature was still 104. Now I wish you'd take this poor little dog home. He shouldn't be here. For a moment I thought the man was going to strike me.
There's nothing wrong with him,
he hissed, his whole face working with emotion. I'm sorry, I said, and went back to the measuring stand. A boy of about 15 was waiting for me with his pony. It was supposed to be in the 13.2 class, but was nearly 1.5 inches over. Much too big, I'm afraid, I said. He can't go in that class. The boy didn't answer. He put his hand inside his jacket and produced a sheet of paper. This is a veterinary certificate to say he's under 13.2. It's no good, I'm sorry. The stewards have told me not to accept any certificates. I've turned down 2 others today. Everything has to go under the stick. It's a pity, but there it is. His manner changed abruptly.
But you've got to accept it,
he shouted in my face.
There doesn't have to be any measurements when you have a certificate.
You better see the stewards. Those are my instructions.
I'll see my father about this, that's what,
he shouted, and led the animal away. Father was quickly on the scene. Big, fat, prosperous-looking, confident. He obviously wasn't going to stand any nonsense from me.
Now look here. I don't know what all this is about, but you've no option in this matter. You have to accept the certificate.
I don't, I assure you. And anyway, it's not as though your pony was slightly over the mark. He's miles over, nowhere near the height. Father flushed dark red.
Well, let me tell you, he was passed through by the vet.
I know, I said, and I heard the gnome give a short laugh. But he's not going through here. There was a brief silence. Then both father and son began to scream at me, and as they continued to hurl abuse, I felt a hand on my arm. It was the man with the moustache again.
I'm going to ask you just once more to take my dog's temperature,
he whispered with a ghastly attempt at a smile.
I'm sure he'll be all right this time. Will you try him again?
I'd had enough.
No, I bloody well won't, I barked. Will you kindly stop bothering me and take the poor animal home?
It's funny how the most unlikely things motivate certain people. It didn't seem a life-and-death matter whether a dog got into a show or not, but it was to the man with the moustache. He started to rave at me.
You don't know your job, that's a job with you. I've come all this way and you've played a dirty trick on me. I've got a friend who's a vet, a proper vet, and I'm going to tell him about you. Yes, I am. I'm going to tell him about you.
At the same time, the father and son were still in full cry, snarling and mouthing at me, and I became suddenly aware that I was in the centre of a hostile circle. The blonde was there too, and some of the others whose ponies I had outed, and they were all staring at me belligerently, making angry gestures. I felt very much alone because the gnome, who had seemed an ally, was nowhere to be seen. I was disappointed in the gnome. He was a big talker, but he had vanished at the first whiff of danger. As I surveyed the threatening crowd, I moved my measuring stick round in front of me. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it might serve to fend them off if they rushed me. And just at that moment, as the unkind words were thick upon the air, I saw Helen and Richard Edmondson on the fringe of the circle, taking it all in. I wasn't worried about him, but again it struck me as strange that it should be my destiny always to be looking a bit of a clown when Helen was around. Anyway, the measuring was over and I felt in need of sustenance. I retreated and went to find Tristan. Chapter 11. The atmosphere in the beer tent was just what I needed. The hot weather had made the place even more popular than usual, and it was crowded. Many of the inhabitants had been there since early morning, and the air was thick with earthy witticisms, immoderate laughter, cries of joy. And the nice thing was that nobody in there cared a damn about the heights of ponies or the temperatures of dogs. I had to fight my way through the crush to reach Tristan, who was leaning across the counter in earnest conversation with a comely young barmaid. The other serving ladies were middle-aged, but his practised eye had picked this one out. Glossy red hair, a puckish face, and an inviting smile. I had been hoping for a soothing chat with him, but he was unable to give me his undivided attention, so after juggling with a glass among the throng for a few minutes, I left. Out on the field, the sun still blazed, the scent of the trampled grass rose into the warm air, The band was playing a selection from Rose Marie, and peace began to steal into my soul. Maybe I could begin to enjoy the show now the pinpricks were over. There was only the family pets to judge, and I was looking forward to that. For about an hour I wandered among the pens of mountainous pigs and haughty sheep, the rows of shorthorn cows with their classical wedge-shaped grace, their level udders and dainty feet. I watched in fascination the contest which was new to me. Shirt-sleeved young men sticking a fork into a straw bale and hurling it high over a bar with a jerk of their thick brown arms. Old Steve Bramley, a local farmer, was judging the heavy horses, and I envied him his massive authority as he stumped, bowler-hatted and glowering around each animal, leaning occasionally on his stick as he took stock of the points. I couldn't imagine anyone daring to argue with him. It was late in the afternoon when the loudspeaker called me to my final duty. The family pets contestants were arranged on wooden chairs drawn up in a wide circle on the turf. They were mainly children, but behind them an interested ring of parents and friends watched me warily as I arrived. The fashion for exotic pets was still in its infancy, but I experienced a mild shock of surprise when I saw the variety of creatures on show. I suppose I must have had a vague mental picture of a few dogs and cats, but I walked round the circle in growing bewilderment, looking down at rabbits, innumerable rabbits of all sizes and colours, guinea pigs, white mice, several budgerigars, 2 tortoises, a canary, a kitten, a parrot, a minor bird, a box of puppies, a few dogs and cats, and a goldfish in a bowl. The smaller pets rested on their owners' knees and others squatted on the ground. How, I asked myself, was I going to come to a decision here? How did you choose between a parrot and a puppy, or a budgie and a bulldog, a mouse and a miner? Then as I circled, it came to me. It couldn't be done. The only way was to question the children in charge and find out which ones looked after their pets best. Which of them knew most about their feeding and general husbandry? I rubbed my hands together and repressed a chuckle of satisfaction. I had something to work on now. I don't like to boast, but I think I can say in all honesty that I carried out an exhaustive scientific survey of that varied group. From the outset I adopted an attitude of cold detachment, mercilessly banishing any ideas of personal preference. If I had been pleasing only myself, I would have given first prize to a gleaming black Labrador sitting by a chair with massive composure and offering me a gracious paw every time I came near. And my second would have been a benevolent tabby. I have always had a thing about tabby cats, which rubbed its cheek against my hand as I talked to its owner. The pups, crawling over each other and grunting obesely, would probably have come third. But I put away these unworthy thoughts and pursued my chosen course. I was distracted to some extent by the parrot, which kept saying, "Hello!" in a voice of devastating refinement like a butler answering a telephone, and the miner, which repeatedly adjured me to "shut door as you go out," in a booming Yorkshire baritone. The only adult in the ring was a bosomy lady with glacial pop eyes and a white poodle on her knee. As I approached, she gave me a challenging stare as though defying me to place her pet anywhere but first. "Hello, little chap," I said, extending my hand. The poodle responded by drawing its lips soundlessly back from its teeth and giving me much the same kind of look as its owner. I withdrew my hand hastily. "Oh, you needn't be afraid of him," the lady said frigidly. "He won't hurt you." I gave a light laugh. "No, I'm sure he won't." I held out my hand once again. "You're a nice little dog, aren't you?" Once more the poodle bared his teeth, and when I persevered by trying to stroke his ears, he snapped noiselessly, his teeth clicking together an inch from my fingers. "He doesn't like you. I can see that. Do you, darling?" The lady put her cheek against the dog's head and stared at me distastefully, as though she knew just how he felt. "Shut door as you go out," commanded the miner gruffly from somewhere behind me. I gave the lady my questionnaire and moved on. And among the throng there was one who stood out. The little boy with the goldfish. In reply to my promptings, he discoursed knowledgeably about his fish, its feeding, life history, and habits. He even had a fair idea of the common diseases. The bowl, too, was beautifully clean and the water fresh. I was impressed. When I had completed the circuit, I swept the ring for the last time with a probing eye. Yes, there was no doubt about it. I had the 3 prize winners fixed in my mind beyond any question, and in an order based on strictly scientific selection. I stepped out into the middle. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, scanning the company with an affable smile.
"Hello!"
responded the parrot, fruitily. I ignored him and continued. "These are the successful entrants. First, number 6, the goldfish. Second, number 15, the guinea pig. And third, number 10, the white kitten." I half expected a little ripple of applause, but there was none. In fact, my announcement was greeted by a tight-lipped silence. I had noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere when I mentioned the goldfish. It was striking. A sudden, cold wave which swept away the expectant smiles and replaced them with discontented muttering. I had done something wrong, but what? I looked around helplessly as the hum of voices increased.
"What do you think of that, then? It's not fair, is it? Wouldn't have thought it of him. All them lovely rabbits, and he hardly looked at him."
I couldn't make it out, but my job was done anyway. I pushed between the chairs and escaped to the open field.
"Shut doors, you go out!"
the miner requested in deepest bass as I departed. I sought out Tristan again. The atmosphere in the beer tent had changed too. The drinkers were long since past their peak, and the hilarious babel which had met me on my last visit had died to an exhausted murmur. There was a general air of satiation. Tristan, pint in hand, was being addressed with great solemnity by a man in a flat cap and braces. The man swayed slightly as he grasped Tristan's free hand and gazed into his eyes. Occasionally he patted him on the shoulder with the utmost affection. Obviously my colleague had been forging deep and lasting friendships in here, while I was making enemies outside. I sidled up to him and spoke into his ear. "Ready to go soon, Tris?" He turned slowly and looked at me. "No, old lad," he said, articulating carefully. "I'm afraid I shan't be coming with you. They're having a dance here on the show field later, and Doreen has consented to accompany me." He cast a loving glance across the counter at the redhead, who crinkled her nose at him. I was about to leave when a snatch of conversation from behind me made me pause.
"A bloody goldfish,"
a voice saying disgustedly.
"Aye, it's a rum 'un, George,"
a second voice replied. There was a slurping sound of beer being downed.
"Got the nose, Fred,"
the first voice said.
"That vet fella had to do it. Didn't have no choice. He couldn't pass over at Squire's son. Reckon you're right, but it's a bugger when you get graft and corruption in family pets."
A heavy sigh, then.
"It's the way things are nowadays, Fred. Everything's ulterior." "You're right there, George. It's ulterior, that's what it is."
I fought down a rising panic. The Pelhams had been lords of the manor of Danbury for generations, and the present squire was Major Pelham. I knew him as a friendly farmer client, but that was all. I'd never heard of his son. I clutched at Tristan's arm. "Who is that little boy over there?" Tristan peered out glassily across the sward.
The one with the goldfish bowl, you mean?"
"That's right."
"It's young Nigel Pelham, the squire's son."
"Oh, God," I moaned. "But I've never seen him before. Where's he been?"
"Boarding school down south, I believe. On holiday just now."
I stared at the boy again. Tousled fair hair, grey open-neck shirt, sunburned legs. Just like all the others. George was at it again.
"Lovely dogs and cats there was, but Squire's lad won it with a bloody goldfish." "Well, let's be right," his companion put in. "If that lad had brought along a bloody stuffed monkey, he'd still have got first prize with it." "No doubt about it, Fred. T'other kids might well have stopped at home." "Aye, it's not like it used to be, George. Nobody does out for an out these days." "True, Fred. Very true."
There was a gloomy silence punctuated by noisy gulpings. Then, in weary tones,
"Well, you and me can't alter it. It's the kind of world we're living in today."
I reeled out into the fresh air and the sunshine. Looking round at the tranquil scene, the long stretch of grass, the loop of pebbly river with the green hills rising behind, I had a sense of unreality. Was there any part of this peaceful cameo of rural England without its sinister undertones? As if by instinct, I made my way into the long marquee which housed the produce section. Surely among those quiet rows of vegetables, I would find repose. The place was almost empty, but as I made my way down the long lines of tables, I came upon the solitary figure of old John William Enderby, who had a little grocer's shop in the town. "Well, how are things?" I inquired.
"Nobbut middling, lad,"
the old man replied morosely. "Why, what's wrong?"
"Well, I got a second with me broad beans, but only a highly commended for me shallots. Look at him."
I looked.
"Yes, they're beautiful shallots, Mr. Enderby. Aye, they are. And nobbut a highly commended. It's an insult, that's what it is. It's an insult.
But, Mr. Enderby,
Highly commended, I mean, that's pretty good, isn't it?" "No, it isn't. It's an insult."
oh,
"Bad luck."
John William stared at me wide-eyed for a moment.
"It's not bad luck, lad. It's not but a twist."
"Oh, surely not."
"I'm telling you. Jim Hulston's got first with his shallots, and the judge is his wife's cousin."
"Never."
"It's true,"
grunted John William, nodding solemnly.
"It's nowt but a twist."
"Well, I'd never heard of such a thing."
"You don't know what goes on, young man. I wasn't even pleased with me tatties. Frank Thompson got first with that lot."
He pointed to a tray of noble tubers. I studied them. "Well, I must admit they look splendid potatoes."
"Aye, they are. But Frank pinched him."
"What?"
"Aye. They took first prize at Brisbane show last Thursday, and Frank pinched them off stand."
I clutched at the nearby table. The foundations of my world were crumbling.
"That can't be true, Mr. Enderby." "I'm not joking nor jesting," declared John William. "Them self and same tatties. I'd know 'em anywhere. It's not but a—"
I could take no more. I fled. Outside, the evening sunshine was still warm, and the whole field was awash with the soft light which in the Dales seems to stream down in a golden flood from the high tops. But it was as if the forces of darkness were pressing on me. All I wanted was to get home. I hurried to the steward's tent and collected my measuring stick, running a gauntlet of hostile stares from the pony people I'd outed earlier in the day. They were still waving their certificates and arguing. On the way to the car, I had to pass several of the ladies who had watched me judge the pets, and though they didn't exactly draw their skirts aside, they managed to convey their message. Among the rows of vehicles, I spotted the man with the moustache. He still hadn't taken his terrier away, and his eyes, full of wounded resentment, followed my every step. I was opening my door when Helen and her party, also apparently on the way home, passed about 50 yards away. Helen waved, I waved back, and Richard Edmondson gave me a nod before helping her into the front seat of a gleaming silver Daimler. The two fathers got into the back. As I settled into the seat of my little Austin, braced my feet against the broken floorboards and squinted through the cracked windscreen, I prayed that just this once the thing would go on the starter. Holding my breath, I pulled at the knob, but the engine gave a couple of lazy turns, then fell silent. Fishing the starting handle from under the seat, I crept out and inserted into its hole under the radiator. And as I began the old familiar winding, the silver monster purred contemptuously past me and away. Dropping into the driver's seat again, I caught sight of my face in the mirror and could see the streaks and flecks of blood still caked on my cheek and around the roots of my hair. Tristan hadn't done a very good job with his bucket of cold water. I looked back at the emptying field and at the Daimler disappearing round a distant bend. And it seemed to me that in more ways than one, the show was over. Chapter 12. As I looked at the group of sick young cattle on the hillside, a mixture of apprehension and disbelief flooded through me. Surely not more trouble for the Dalbys. The old saw, "It never rains but it pours," seems to apply with particular force to farming. The husk outbreak last year, and now this. It had all started with the death of Billy Dalby. Big, slow-smiling, slow-talking Billy. He was as strong and tough as any of the shaggy beasts which ranged his fields, but he had just melted away in a few weeks. Cancer of the pancreas, they said it was, and Billy was gone before anybody could realize it, and there was only his picture smiling down from the kitchen mantelpiece on his wife and 3 young children. The general opinion was that Mrs. Dalby should sell up and get out. You needed a man to run this place, and anyway, Prospect House was a bad farm. Neighbouring farmers would stick out their lower lips and shake their heads when they looked at the boggy pastures on the low side of the house, with the tufts of spiky grass sticking from the sour soil, or at the rocky outcrops and scattered stones on the hillside fields. No, it was a poor place, and a woman would never make a go of it. Everybody thought the same thing, except Mrs. Dalby herself. There wasn't much of her. In fact, she must have been one of the smallest women I've ever seen, around 5 feet high, but there was a core of steel in her. She had her own mind and her own way of doing things. I remember when Billy was still alive and I had been injecting some sheep up there, and Mrs. Dalby called me into the house. "You'll have a cup of tea, Mr. Herriot?" She said it in a gracious way, not casually, her head slightly to one side and a dignified little smile on her face. And when I went into the kitchen, I knew what I would find. The inevitable tray. It was always a tray with Mrs. Dalby. The hospitable Dales people were continually asking me in for some kind of refreshment. A bit of dinner, perhaps, but if it wasn't midday, there was usually a mug of tea and a scone or a hunk of thick-crusted apple pie. But Mrs. Dalby invariably set out a special tray. And there it was today, with a clean cloth, and the best china cup and saucer and side plates with sliced buttered scones and iced cake and malt bread and biscuits. It was on its own table away from the big kitchen table. "Do sit down, Mr. Herriot," she said in her precise manner. "I hope that tea isn't too strong for you." Her speech was what the farmers would call very proper, but it went with her personality, which to me embodied a determination to do everything as correctly as possible. "Looks perfect to me, Mrs. Dalby." I sat down, feeling somewhat exposed in the middle of the kitchen, with Billy smiling comfortably from an old armchair by the fire and his wife standing by my side. She never sat down with us, but stood there very erect, hands clasped in front of her, head inclined, ceremoniously attending to my every wish. "Let me fill your cup, Mr. Herriot," or "Won't you try some of this custard tart?" She wasn't what you would call pretty. It was a rough-skinned, red little face with tiny, very dark eyes, but there was a sweet expression and a quiet dignity. And as I say, there was strength. Billy died in the spring, and as everybody waited for Mrs. Dalby to make arrangements for the sale, she went right on with the running of the farm. She did it with the help of a big farm worker called Charlie, who had helped Billy occasionally, but now came full-time. During the summer I was called out a few times for trivial ailments among the cattle, and I could see that Mrs. Dalby was managing to hang on. She looked a bit haggard because she was now helping in the fields and buildings as well as coping with her housework and young family, but she was still fighting. It was halfway through September when she asked me to call to see some young cattle, stirks of around 9 months, which were coughing. "They were really fit when they were turned out in May," she said as we walked across the grass to the gate in the corner. "But they've gone down badly this last week or two." I held the gate open, we walked through, and as I approached the group of animals I grew progressively uneasy. Even at this distance I could see that something was far wrong. They were not moving around or grazing as they should have been, but were curiously immobile. There would be about 30 of them, and many had their necks extended forward as if seeking air. And from the bunch a barking cough was carried to us on the soft breeze of late summer. By the time we reached the cattle, my uneasiness had been replaced by a dry-mouthed dread. They didn't seem to care as I moved in among them, and I had to shout and wave my arms to get them moving. and they had barely begun to stir before the coughing broke out throughout the group, not just an occasional bark, but a hacking chorus which seemed almost to be tearing the little animals apart. And they weren't just coughing. Most of them were panting, standing straddle-legged, ribs heaving in a desperate fight for breath. A few showed bubbles of saliva at their lips, and from here and there among the pack groans of agony sounded as the lungs laboured. I turned as in a dream to Mrs. Dalby. "They've got husk." Even as I said it, it sounded a grimly inadequate description of the tragedy I was witnessing. Because this was neglected husk, a terrible, doom-laden thing. "Husk," the little woman said brightly. "What causes it?" I looked at her for a moment, then tried to make my voice casual. "Well, it's a parasite. A tiny worm which infests the bronchial tubes and sets up bronchitis. In fact, that's the proper name, parasitic bronchitis. The larvae climb up the blades of grass and the cattle eat them as they graze. Some pastures are badly affected with it." I broke off. A lecture was out of place at a time like this. What I felt like saying was, why in God's name hadn't I been called in weeks ago? Because this wasn't only bronchitis now. It was pneumonia, pleurisy, emphysema, and any other lung condition you cared to name, with not merely a few of the hair-like worms irritating the tubes, but great, seething masses of them, crawling everywhere, balling up and blocking the vital air passages. I had opened up a lot of calves like these, and I knew how it looked. I took a deep breath. "They're pretty bad, Mrs. Dalby. A mild attack isn't so bad if you can get them off the grass right away, but this has gone a long way beyond that. See for yourself, can't you? Like a lot of little skeletons. I wish..." She looked up apprehensively, and I decided not to belabor the point. I rubbed it in, saying what her nature said all along, that her inexperience would trouble sooner or later. If Billy had been here, he probably would never have turned his battle to the field, or would have spent the trouble right out. Charlie would be no help in a situation like this. He was a good, willing chap, but lived up to the Yorkshire saying, "Strong in arm and thick in head." Farming experienced agriculturist who knew his own farm inside out just wasn't there. Mrs. Dalby drew herself up with that familiar gesture. "Well, what can we do about it, Mr. Herriot?" An honest reply in those days would have been, medicinally, nothing. But I didn't say that. "We've got to get them all inside immediately. Every mouthful of this grass is adding to the worm burden. Is Charlie around to give us a hand?" "Yes, he's in the next field and mending a wall." She trotted across the turf and in a minute or two returned with the big man ambling by her side. "Aye, I thought it were a touch of husk," he said amiably and with a hint of eagerness. "Are you going to give them the throat injection?" Yes, but let's get them up to the buildings." As we drove the cattle slowly up the green slope, I marvelled ruefully at this further example of faith in the intratracheal injection for husk. There was really no treatment for the condition, and it would be another 20 years before one appeared in the shape of diethyl carbamazine. But the accepted procedure was to inject a mixture of chloroform, turpentine and creosote into the windpipe. Modern vets may raise their eyebrows at the idea of introducing this barbaric concoction directly into the delicate lung tissue, and we old ones didn't think much of it either. But the farmers loved it. When we had finally got the stirks into the fold yard, I looked around with something like despair. The short journey had exacerbated their symptoms tremendously, and I stood in the middle of a symphony of coughs, grunts and groans, while the cattle, tongues protruding, ribs pumping, gasped for breath. I got a bottle of the wonderful injection from the car, and with Charlie holding the head and little Mrs. Dalby hanging onto the tail, I began to go through the motions. Seizing the trachea in my left hand, I inserted the needle between the cartilaginous rings and squirted a few cc's into the lumen, and, as always, the stirk gave a reflex cough, sending up the distinctive aroma of the medicaments into our faces. "By God, you can smell it straight off, Governor," Charlie said with deep satisfaction. "You can tell it's getting right to its spot." Most of the farmers said something like that, and they had faith. The book spoke comfortably about the chloroform stupefying the worms, the turpentine killing them, and the creosote causing increased coughing which expelled them. But I didn't believe a word of it. The good results which followed were, in my opinion, due entirely to bringing the animals in from the infected pasture. But I knew I had to do it, and we injected every animal in the yard. There were 32 of them, and Mrs. Dalby's tiny figure was involved in the catching of all of them, clutching vainly at their necks, grabbing their tails, pushing them up against the wall. William, the eldest son, aged 8, came in from school and plunged into the fray by his mother's side. My repeated, "Be careful, Mrs. Dalby," or Charlie's gruff, "Watch yourself, missus, or you'll get lamed," had no effect. During the melee, both she and the little boy were kicked, trodden on and knocked down, but they never showed the slightest sign of being discouraged. At the end, the little woman turned to me, her face flushed to an even deeper hue. Panting, she looked up. "Is there anything else we can do, Mr. Herriot?" "Yes, there is." In fact, the two things I was going to tell her were the only things which ever did any good. "First, I'm going to leave you some medicine for the worms which are in the stomach. We can get at them there, so Charlie must give every stirk a dose. Secondly, you'll have to start giving them the best possible food, good hay and high-protein cake." Her eyes widened. "Cake? That's expensive stuff. And hay—" I knew what she was thinking. The precious hay safely garnered for next winter's feed. To have to start using it now was a cruel blow, especially with all that beautiful grass out there. Grass, the most natural, most perfect food for cattle, but every blade carrying its own load of death. "Can't they go out again? Ever?" she asked in a small voice. "No, I'm sorry. If they had had just a mild attack, you could have kept them in at nights and turned them out after the dew had left the grass in the mornings. The larvae climb up the grass mainly when it's wet. But your cattle have got too far. We daren't risk them picking up any more worms." "Right. Thank you, Mr. Herriot. We know where we are anyway." She paused. "Do you think we'll lose any of them?" My stomach contracted into a tight ball. I had already told her to buy cake she couldn't afford, and it was a certainty she would have to lay out more precious cash for hay in the winter. How was I going to tell her that nothing in the world was going to stop this batch of beasts dying like flies? When animals with husks started blowing bubbles, it was nearly hopeless, and the ones which were groaning with every breath were quite simply doomed. Nearly half of them were in these two categories. And what about the rest? The pathetic barking other half. Well, they had a chance. "Mrs. Dalby," I said, "it would be wrong of me to make light of this. Some of them are going to die. In fact, unless there's a miracle, you are going to lose quite a few of them." At the sight of her stricken face, I made an attempt to be encouraging. "However, where there's life, there's hope, and sometimes you get pleasant surprises at this job." I held up a finger. "Worm them and get some good grub into them. That's your hope, to help them fight it off themselves." "I see." She lifted her chin in her characteristic way. "And now you must come in for a wash." And of course there it was in its usual place in the kitchen, the tray with all the trimmings. "Really, Mrs. Dalby, you shouldn't have bothered. You've enough to do without this." "Nonsense," she said, the smile back on her face. "You take 1 spoonful of sugar, don't you?" As I sat there, she stood in her habitual position, hands clasped in front of her, watching me, while the middle boy, Dennis, who was 5, looked up at me solemnly, and Michael, a mere toddler of 2, fell over the coal scuttle and started to bawl lustily. The usual procedure was to repeat the intratracheal injection in 4 days, so I had to go through with it. Anyway, it gave me a chance to see how the cattle were faring. When I drew up in the yard, my first sight was of a long, sack-covered mound on the cobbles. A row of hooves protruded from beneath the sacks. I had expected something of the sort, but the reality was still like a blow in the face. It was still quite early in the morning, and perhaps I wasn't feeling quite strong enough to have the evidence of my failure thrust before my eyes. Because failure it undoubtedly was. Even though I had been in a hopeless position from the start, there was something damning in those motionless hooves jutting from their rough blanket. I made a quick count. There were 4 dead cattle under there. Wearily I made my way into the fold yard. I had no cheerful expectation of what I would find inside. 2 of the stirks were down and unable to rise from the deep straw. The rest were still panting, but I noticed with a faint lifting of my gloom that several of them were doggedly munching at the cubes of cake in the troughs, and others were pulling an occasional wisp of hay from the racks. It was incredible how animals with advanced respiratory symptoms would still eat, and it provided the only gleam of hope. I walked over to the house. Mrs. Dalby greeted me cheerfully as though those carcasses outside didn't exist. "It's time for the second injection," I said, and then after some hesitation, "I see you've lost 4 of them. I'm sorry." "Well, you told me, Mr. Herriot." She smiled through the tired lines in her face. "You said I had to expect it, so it wasn't as big a shock as it might have been." She finished washing the youngest child's face, seized the towel in her work-roughened hands, and rubbed him briskly. Then she straightened up. It was Saturday and William was at home, and I noticed not for the first time that there was something about the little boy which suggested that even at his age he had decided he was going to be the man about the house. He pulled on his little Wellingtons and marched resolutely with us across the yard to do his bit as he saw it. I rested my hand on his shoulder as he walked beside me. He would have to grow up a lot more rapidly than most youngsters, but I had the feeling that the realities of life wouldn't bowl him over very easily. We gave the animals their second injection, with the 2 little Dalbys again throwing themselves fearlessly into the rough and tumble, and that was about the last practical thing I did in the husk outbreak. Looking back, there is a macabre fascination in recalling situations like this when we veterinary surgeons were utterly helpless in the face of inevitable disaster. Nowadays, thank heavens, the young members of the profession do not have to stand among a group of gasping, groaning creatures with the sick knowledge that they can't do a thing about it. They have an excellent oral vaccine to prevent husk and efficient therapeutic agents to treat it. But with the Dalbys, who needed my help so desperately, I had nothing to offer. My memories are of repeated, comfortless visits, of death, and of an all-pervading reek of chloroform, creosote, and turpentine. When the business had finally come to an end, a dozen of the stirks had died. About 5 were alive but blowing hard and would probably be stunted and unthrifty for the rest of their lives. The rest, thanks to the good feeding and not to my treatment, had recovered. It was a crushing blow for any farmer to take, but for a widow struggling to survive, it could have been fatal. But on my last visit, little Mrs. Dalby, hovering as usual, hands clasped above the tea tray, was undefeated. "Only them as has 'em can lose 'em," she said firmly, her head tilted as always. I had heard that said many times, and they were brave Yorkshire words, but I wondered, did she have enough to be able to lose so many? She went on, "I know you've told me not to turn the young beasts onto that field next year, but isn't there anything we can give them to stop them getting husk?" "No, Mrs. Dalby, I'm sorry." I put down my cup. "I don't think there's anything country vets need and want more than a husk vaccine. People keep asking us that question, and we have to keep on saying no." We had to keep on saying no for another 20 years, as we watched disasters like I had just seen at the Dalbys. And the strange thing is that now we have a first-rate vaccine, it is taken completely for granted. Driving away, I stopped to open the gate at the end of the track and looked back at the old stone farmhouse crouching against the lower slopes. It was a perfect autumn day, with mellow golden sunshine softening the harsh sweep of fell and moor with their striding walls, and the air so still and windless that the whirring of a pigeon's wings overhead was loud in the silence. Across the valley on the hilltop, a frieze of sparse trees stood, as motionless as though they'd been painted across the blue canvas of sky. It seemed wrong that in the midst of this beauty was worry and anxiety, grinding struggle and the threat of ruin. I closed the gate and got back into the car. That little woman over there may have weathered this calamity, but as I started the engine, the thought was strong in my mind that another such thing would finish her. Chapter 13. I was vastly relieved when winter came and spring followed, and I saw virtually nothing of Mrs. Dalby. It was one market day in midsummer that she came to the surgery. I was just going to open the door when Siegfried beat me to it. More than most people, he appreciated the hospitality we were shown on the farms, and he had sampled Mrs. Dalby's tray as often as I had. On top of that, he had the deepest admiration for her indomitable battle to keep the farm going for her children, so that whenever she appeared at Scaledale House he received her like royalty. His manners, always impeccable, became those of a Spanish grandee. I watched him now as he threw the door wide and hurried to the top step.
"Why, Mrs. Dalby, how very nice to see you. Do come inside."
He extended his hand towards the house. The little woman, dignified as ever, inclined her head, smiled, and walked past while Siegfried hastened to her side. And as they negotiated the passage, he kept up a running fire of inquiries.
"And how is William? And Dennis? And little Michael? Good, good, splendid."
At the living-room door there was the same ceremonious opening and courteous gestures, and once inside, a tremendous scraping of armchairs as he hauled them around to make sure she was comfortable and in the right position. Next he galloped through to the kitchen to organise some refreshment, and when Mrs. Hall appeared with the tray, he rated with an anxious glance as though he feared it might fall below the standard of Mrs. Dalby's. Apparently reassured, he poured the tea, hovered around solicitously for a moment or two, then sat down opposite, the very picture of rapt attention. The little woman thanked him and sipped at her cup. "Mr. Farnan, I have called to see you about some young beasts. I turned a batch of 35 out this spring, and they looked in good condition, but now they're losing ground fast. All of them." My heart gave a great thump, and something must have shown in my face because she smiled across at me. "Oh, don't worry, Mr. Herriot, it's not husk again. There's not a cough among the lot of them. But they are going thin, and they're badly scoured."
"I think I know what that will be," Siegfried said, leaning across to push a plate of Mrs. Hall's flapjack towards her. "They'll have picked up a few worms, not lungworms, but the stomach and intestinal kind. They probably just need a good dose of medicine to clear them out."
She nodded and took a piece of the flapjack.
"Yes, that's what Charlie thought, and we've dosed a lot of them, but it doesn't seem to have made any difference." "That's funny." Siegfried rubbed his chin. "Mind you, they sometimes need a repeat, but you should have seen some improvement. Perhaps you better have a look at them."
"That's what I would like," she said. "It would set my mind at rest." Siegfried opened the appointment book.
"Right, and the sooner the better. Tomorrow morning, all right? Splendid." He made a quick note, then looked up at her. "By the way, I'm going off for a week's holiday starting this evening, so Mr. Herriot will be coming."
"That'll be fine," she replied, turning to me and smiling without a trace of doubt or misgiving. If she was thinking, "This is the fellow who supervised the deaths of nearly half of my young stock last year," she certainly didn't show it. In fact, when she finally finished her tea and left, she waved and smiled again as though she could hardly wait to see me again. And when I walked across the fields with Mrs. Dalby next day, it was like turning the clock back to last year, except that we were going in the other direction. Not down towards the marshy ground below the house, but up to the stony pastures which climbed in an uneven checkerboard between their stone walls over the lower slopes of the hill. The similarity persisted as we approached, too. These young beasts, roans, reds, red and whites, were an almost exact counterpart of last year's batch. Shaggy little creatures, little more than calves, they stood, spindly-legged and knock-kneed, regarding us apathetically as we came up the rise. And though their symptoms were entirely different from the previous lot, there was one thing I could say for sure. They were very ill. As I watched, I could see the dark, watery diarrhea flowing from them without any lifting of the tails, as though there was nothing they could do to control it. And every one of them was painfully thin, the skin stretched over the jutting pelvic bones and the protruding rows of ribs. "I haven't neglected them this time," Mrs. Dalby said. "I know they look dreadful, but this seems to have happened within a few days." Yes, I see." My eyes were hunting desperately among the little animals, trying to find some sort of clue. I had seen unthriftiness from parasitism, but nothing like this. "Have you kept a lot of cattle in these fields over the last year or two?" I asked. She paused in thought for a moment. No, I don't think so. Billy used to let the milk cows graze up here now and then, but that's all." The grass wouldn't be likely to be sick with worms, then. In any case, it didn't look like that. What it did look like was Jonas disease. But how in God's name could 35 young things like this get Jonas at the same time? Salmonella, Coccidiosis, some form of poisoning perhaps. This was the time of year when cattle ate strange plants. I walked slowly round the field, but there was nothing unusual to be seen. It took even the grass all its time to grow on these wind-blown hillsides, and there was no great range of other herbage. I could see bracken higher up the fell, but none down here. Billy would have cleared it years ago. "Mrs. Dalby," I said, "I think you better give these stirks another dose of the worm medicine just to be sure, and in the meantime I'm going to take some samples of the manure for examination at the laboratory." I brought up some sterile jars from the car and went painstakingly round the pasture, scooping up as wide a range as possible from the pools of faeces. I took them to the lab myself and asked them to phone the results through. The call came within 24 hours. Negative for everything. I resisted the impulse to dash out to the farm immediately. There was nothing I could think of doing, and it wouldn't look so good for me to stand there gawping at the beasts and scratching my head. Better to wait till tomorrow to see if the second dose of worm medicine did any good. There was no reason why it should, because none of the samples showed a pathogenic worm burden. In these cases, I always hope that inspiration will come to me as I'm driving around, or even when I'm examining other animals. But at this time, as I climbed from the car outside Prospect House, I was barren of ideas. The young beasts were slightly worse. I had decided that if I still couldn't think of anything, I would give the worst ones vitamin injections, more or less for the sake of doing something. So with Charlie holding the heads, I inserted the hypodermic under the taut skins of 10 of the little creatures, trying at the same time to put away the feeling of utter futility. We didn't have to drive them inside. They were easily caught in the open field, and that was a bad sign in itself. "Well, you'll let me know, Mrs. Dalby," I said hoarsely as I got back into the car. "If that injection improves them, I'll do the lot." I gave what I hoped was a confident wave and drove off. I felt so bad that it had a numbing effect on me, and over the next few days my mind seemed to shy away from the subject of the Dalby stirks, as though, by not thinking about them, they would just go away. I was reminded they were still very much there by a phone call from Mrs. Dalby. "I'm afraid my cattle aren't doing any good, Mr. Herriot." Her voice was strained. I grimaced into the receiver. "And the ones I injected? Just the same as the others?" I had to face up to reality now and drove out to Prospect House immediately. But the feeling of cold emptiness, of having nothing to offer, made the journey a misery. I hadn't the courage to go to the farmhouse and face Mrs. Dalby, but hurried straight up through the fields to where the young beasts were gathered. And when I walked among them and studied them at close range, the apprehension I had felt on the journey was nothing to the sick horror which rushed through me now. Another catastrophe was imminent here. The big follow-up blow, which was all that was needed to knock the Dalby family out once and for all, was on its way. These animals were going to die. Not just half of them like last year, but all of them, because there was hardly any variation in their symptoms. There didn't seem to be a single one of them which was fighting off the disease. But what disease? God almighty, I was a veterinary surgeon, maybe not steeped in experience, but I wasn't a new beginner anymore. I would surely have some small inkling why a whole great batch of young beasts were sinking towards the knacker yard in front of my eyes. I could see Mrs. Dalby coming up the field, with little William striding in his tough, arm-swinging way by her side, and Charlie following behind. What the hell was I going to say to them? Shrug my shoulders with a slight laugh and say I hadn't a single clue in my head and that it would probably be best to phone Malek now and ask them to shoot the lot of them straight away for dog meat? Stumbling among the stricken creatures, I gazed at them in turn, almost choking as I looked at the drooping, sunken-eyed heads, the gaunt little bodies, the eternal trickle of that deadly scar. There was a curious immobility about the group, probably because they were too weak to walk about. In fact, as I watched, one of them took a few steps, swayed, and almost fell. Charlie was pushing open the gate into the field just 100 yards away. I turned and stared at the nearest animal, almost beseeching it to tell me what was wrong with it, where it felt the pain, how this thing had all started, but I got no response. The stirk, one of the smallest, only calf-size, with a very dark, roan-coloured head, showed not the slightest interest, but gazed back at me incuriously through its spectacles. What was that? What was I thinking about? Spectacles? Was my reason toppling? But yes, by God, he did have spectacles, a ring of lighter hair surrounding each eye, and that other beast over there, he was the same. Oh, glory be, now I knew! At last I knew! Mrs. Dalby, panting slightly, had reached me. "Good morning, Mr. Herriot," she said, trying to smile. "What do you think, then?" She looked around the cattle with anxious eyes. "Ah, good morning to you, Mrs. Dalby," I replied expansively, fighting down the impulse to leap in the air and laugh and shout and perhaps do a few cartwheels. "Yes, I've had a look at them, and it is pretty clear now what the trouble is." "Really? Then what—" "It's copper deficiency." I said it casually, as though I had been turning such a thing over in my mind right from the beginning. "You can tell by the loss of the pigment in the coat, especially round the eyes. In fact, when you look at them, you can see that a lot of them are a bit paler than normal." I waved an airy hand in the general direction of the stirks. Charlie nodded. "Aye, by go, you're right. I thought they'd gone a funny colour." "Can we cure it?" Mrs. Dalby asked the inevitable question. "Oh, yes. I'm going straight back to the surgery now to make up a copper mixture, and we'll dose the lot. And you'll have to repeat that every fortnight while they're out at grass. It's a bit of a nuisance, I'm afraid, but there's no other way. Can you do it?" "Oh, aye, we'll do it," Charlie said. And, "Aye, we'll do it," little William echoed, sticking out his chest and strutting around aggressively as though he wanted to start catching the beast right away. The treatment had a spectacular effect. I didn't have the modern long-lasting copper injections at my disposal, but the solution of copper sulphate which I concocted under the surgery tap at Scaledale House worked like magic. Within a few weeks that batch of stirks was capering lively and fully fleshed over those hillside fields. Not a single death, no lingering unthriftiness. It was as though the whole thing had never happened, as though the hand of doom had never hovered over not only the cattle, but the little family of humans. It had been a close thing, and I realized only a respite. That little woman had a long, hard fight ahead of her still. I've always abhorred change of any kind, but it pleases me to come forward 20 years and spectate at another morning in the kitchen at Prospect House. I was seated at the same little table, picking a buttered scone from the same tray, and wondering whether I should follow it with a piece of malt bread or one of the jam tarts. Billy still smiled down from the mantelpiece, and Mrs. Dalby, hands clasped in front of her, was watching me, her head a little on one side, the same half-smile curving her lips. The years had not altered her much. There was some grey in her hair, but the little red, weathered face and the bright eyes were as I had always known them. I sipped my tea and looked across at the vast bulk of William sprawled in his father's old chair, smiling his father's smile at me. There were about 15 stones of William, and I had just been watching him in action as he held a fully grown bullock's hind foot while I examined it. The animal had made a few attempts to kick, but the discouragement on its face had been obvious as William's great hands effortlessly engulfed its fetlock, and a corner of his wide shoulder span dug into its abdomen. No, I couldn't expect William to be the same, nor Dennis and Michael clattering into the kitchen now in their heavy boots and moving over to the sink to wash their hands. They were 6-footers too, with their father's high-shouldered, easy-slouching walk, but without William's sheer bulk. Their tiny mother glanced at them, then up at the picture on the mantelpiece. "It would have been our 30th anniversary today," she said conversationally. I looked up at her, surprised. She never spoke of such things, and I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't very well say congratulations when she had spent 20 of those years alone. She had never said a word about her long fight, and it had been a winning fight. She had bought the neighbouring farm lower down the dale when old Mr. Mason retired. It was a good farm, with better land, and William had lived there after his marriage, and they ran the two places as one. Things were pretty good now, with her 3 expert stocksman sons eliminating the need for outside labour, except old Charlie, who still pottered around doing odd jobs. "Yes, 30 years, Mrs. Dalby said, looking slowly round the room as though she was seeing it for the first time. Then she turned back and bent over me, her face serious. "Mr. Herriot," she said, and I was sure that at last, on this special day, she was going to say something about the years of struggle, the nights of worry and tears, the grinding toil. For a moment she rested her hand lightly on my shoulder,
and her eyes looked into mine. "Mr. Herriot, are you quite sure that tea is to your liking?" Chapter 14. One of the things Helen and I had to do was furnish our bedsitter and kitchen. And when I say furnish, I use the word in its most austere sense. We had no high-flown ideas about luxury. It was, after all, a temporary arrangement, and anyway we had no money to throw around. My present to Helen at the time of our marriage was a modest gold watch, and this had depleted my capital to the extent that a bank statement at the commencement of our married life revealed the sum of 25 shillings standing to my credit. Admittedly, I was a partner now, but when you start from scratch, it takes a long time to get your head above water. But we did need the essentials, like a table, chairs, cutlery, crockery, the odd rug and carpet, and Helen and I decided that it would be most sensible to pick up these things at house sales. Since I was constantly going round the district, I was able to drop in on these events, and the duty of acquiring our necessities had been delegated to me. But after a few weeks it was clear that I was falling down on the job. I had never realized it before, but I had a blind spot in these matters. I would go to a sale and come away with a pair of brass candlesticks and a stuffed owl. On another occasion I acquired an ornate inkwell with a carved metal figure of a dog on it, together with a polished wooden box with innumerable fascinating little drawers and compartments for keeping homeopathic prescriptions. I could go on for a long time about the things I bought, but they were nearly all useless. Helen was very nice about it. "Jim," she said one day, when I was proudly showing her a model of a fully rigged sailing ship and a bottle, which I'd been lucky enough to pick up, "it's lovely, but I don't think we need it right now." I must have been a big disappointment to the poor girl, and also to the local auctioneers who ran the sales. These gentlemen, when they saw me hovering around the back of the crowd, would cheer up visibly. They, in common with most country folk, thought all vets were rich, and that I would be bidding for some of the more expensive items. When a nice baby grand piano came up, they would look over their heads at me with an expectant smile, and their disappointment was evident when I finally went away with a cracked-faced barometer or a glove stretcher. A sense of my failure began to seep through to me, and when I had to take a sample through to the Leeds laboratory, I saw a chance to atone. "Helen," I said, "there's a huge sale room right in the city centre. I'll take an hour off and go in there. I'm bound to see something we need." "Oh, good," my wife replied. "That's a great idea. There'll be lots to choose from there. You haven't had much chance to find anything in these country sales." Helen was always kind. After my visit to the Leeds lab, I asked the way to the sale rooms. "Leave your car here," one of the locals advised me. "You'll never park in the main street, and you can get a tram right to the door." I was glad I listened to him, because when I arrived, the traffic was surging both ways in a non-stop stream. The sale room was at the top of an extraordinarily long flight of smooth stone steps leading right to the top of the building. When I arrived, slightly out of breath, I thought immediately I'd come to the right place. A vast enclosure strewn with furniture, cookers, gramophones, carpets, everything you could possibly want in a house. I wandered around, fascinated for quite a long time. Then my attention centred on two tall piles of books quite near to where the auctioneer was selling. I lifted one of them. It was The Geography of the World. I had never seen such beautiful books, as big as encyclopedias and with thick embossed covers and gold lettering. The pages, too, were edged with gold, and the paper was of a delightfully smooth texture. Quite enthralled, I turned the pages, marvelling at the handsome illustrations, the coloured pictures each with its covering transparent sheet. They were a little old-fashioned, no doubt, and when I looked at the front I saw they were printed in 1858. But they were things of beauty. Looking back, I feel that fate took a hand here, because I'd just reluctantly turned away when I heard the auctioneer's voice. "Now then, here's a lovely set of books, The Geography of the World in 24 volumes. Just look at them. You don't find books like them today. Who'll give me a bid?" I agreed with him. They were unique, but they must be worth pounds. I looked round the company, but nobody said a word. "Come on, ladies and gentlemen, surely somebody wants this wonderful addition to their library. Now, what do I hear?" Among the silence then,
A seedy-looking man in a soiled mackintosh spoke up. "£0.5, he said morosely. I looked around, expecting a burst of laughter at this sally, but nobody was amused. In fact, the auctioneer didn't seem surprised. "I have £0.5 bid." He glanced about him and raised his hammer. With a thudding of the heart, I realised he was going to sell. I heard my own voice, slightly breathless. 3 shillings. "I have a bid of 3 shillings for the Geography of the World in 24 volumes. Are you all done?" Bang went the hammer. "Sold to the gentleman over there." They were mine. I couldn't believe my luck. This surely was the bargain to end all bargains. I paid my 3 shillings while one of the men tied a length of rough string round each pile. The first pause in my elation came when I tried to lift my purchases. Books are heavy things, and these were massive specimens, and there were 24 of them. With a hand under each string, I heaved like a weightlifter, and pop-eyed, veins standing out on my forehead, I managed to get them off the ground and began to stagger shakily to the exit. The first string broke on the top step, and 12 of my volumes cascaded downwards over the smooth stone. After the first moment of panic, I decided that the best way was to transport the intact set down to the bottom and then come back for the others. I did this, but it took me some time, and I began to perspire before I was all tied up again and poised on the curb, ready to cross the road. The second string broke right in the middle of the tram lines as I attempted a stiff-legged dash through a break in the traffic. For about a year I scrabbled there in the middle of the road while horns hooted, tram bells clanged, and an interested crowd watched from the sidewalks. I had just got the escaped volumes in a column and was reknotting the string when the other lot burst from their binding and slithered gently along the metal rails. And it was when I was retrieving them that I noticed a large policeman, attracted by the din and the long line of vehicles, walking with measured strides in my direction. In my mental turmoil, I saw myself for the first time in the hands of the law. I could be down on several charges: breach of the peace, obstructing traffic, to name only 2, but I perceived that the officer was approaching very slowly. And, rightly or wrongly, I feel that when a policeman strolls toward you like that, he is a decent chap and is giving you a chance to get away. I took my chance. He was still several yards off when I had my 2 piles reassembled, and I thrust my hands under the strings, tottered to the far curb, and lost myself in the crowd. When I finally decided there was no longer any fear of feeling the dread grip on my shoulder, I stopped in my headlong flight and rested in a shop doorway. I was puffing like a broken-winded horse, and my hands hurt abominably. The saleroom string was coarse, hairy, and abrasive, and already it threatened to take the skin off my fingers. Anyway, I thought, the worst was over. The tram stop was just at the end of the block there. I joined the queue, and when the tram arrived, shuffled forward with the others. I had one foot on the step when a large hand was thrust before my eyes. "Just a minute, brother, just a minute. Where do you think you're going?" The face under the conductor's hat was the meaty, heavy-jowled, pop-eyed kind, which seems to take a mournful pleasure in imparting bad news. "You're not bringing that bloody lot on here, brother. I'll tell thee now." I stared at him in dismay. "But it's just a few books." "Few books? You want a bloody delivery van for that lot? You're not using my tram. Passengers couldn't stir inside." His mouth turned down aggressively. "Oh, but really," I said with a ghastly attempt at an ingratiating smile, "I'm just going as far as—" "You're not going anywhere in here, brother. I've no time to argue. Move your foot, I'm off." The bell ding-dinged, and the tram began to move. As I hopped off backwards, one of the strings broke again. After I got myself sorted out, I surveyed my situation, and it appeared fairly desperate. The car must be over a mile away, mostly uphill, and I would defy the most stalwart Nepalese Sherpa to transport these books that far. I could, of course, just abandon the things, lean them against the wall and take to my heels, but no. That would be antisocial, and anyway, they were beautiful. If only I could get them home, all would be well. Another tram rumbled up to the stop, and again I hefted my burden and joined the ingoing passengers, hoping nobody would notice. It was a female voice this time. "Sorry, you can't come on, love." She was middle-aged, motherly, and her plump figure bulged her uniform tightly. "We don't have delivery men on our trams. It's against rules." I repressed a scream.
But I'm not... These are my own books. I've just bought them. Bought them? Her eyebrows went up as she stared at the dusty volumes. Yes, and I've got to get them home somehow. Well, somebody'll take them home for you, love. Has they got far to go? Darrowby. By gum, that's a long way, right out in country. She peered into the tram's interior. But there isn't no room in here, love. The passengers had all filed in, and I was left alone, standing between my twin edifices, and the conductress must have seen a desperate light in my eyes because she made a sudden gesture. Come on then, love. You stand out here on the platform with me. I'm not supposed to, but I can't see you stuck there. I didn't know whether to kiss her or burst into tears. In the end, I did neither, but stacked the books in a corner of the platform and stood swaying over them till we arrived at the park where I had left my car. The relief at my deliverance was such that I laughed off the few extra contretemps on the way to the car. There were, in fact, several more spills before I had the books tucked away on the back seat, but when I finally drove away, I felt like singing. It was when I was threading my way through the traffic that I began to rejoice that I lived in the country, because the car was filled with an acrid smell which I thought could only come from the conglomeration of petrol fumes and industrial smoke. But even when the city had been left behind and I was climbing into the swelling green of the Pennines, the aroma was still with me. I wound down the window and gulped greedily as the sweet, grassy air flowed in, but when I closed it, the strange pungency returned immediately. I stopped, leant over and sniffed at the region of the back seat, and there was no doubt about it. It was the books. Ah, well, they must have been kept in a damp place or something like that. I was sure it would soon pass off. But in the meantime, it certainly was powerful. It nearly made my eyes water. I had never really noticed the long climb to our eyrie on top of Scaledale House, but it was different today. I suppose my arms and shoulders were finally beginning to feel the strain, and that string, bristly but fragile, was digging into my hands harder than ever. But it was true that every step was an effort, and when I at last gained the top landing, I almost collapsed against the door of our bed-sitter. When, perspiring and dishevelled, I entered, Helen was on her knees dusting the hearth. She looked up at me expectantly. "Any luck, Jim?" "Yes, I think so," I replied with a trace of smugness. "I think I got a bargain." Helen rose and looked at me eagerly. "Really?" "Yes." I decided to play my trump card. I only had to spend 3 shillings. 3 shillings? What? Well, where? Wait there a minute. I went out to the landing and put my hand under those strings. This, thank heaven, would be the last time I would have to do this. A lunge and a heave, and I had my prizes through the doorway and displayed for my wife's inspection. She stared at the 2 piles. "What have you got there?" "The Geography of the World in 24 volumes, I replied triumphantly. "The Geography of the... And is that all?" "Yes. Couldn't manage anything else, I'm afraid, but look. Aren't they magnificent books?" My wife's level gaze had something of disbelief, a little of wonder. For a moment, one corner of her mouth turned up, then she coughed and became suddenly brisk. "Ah, well, we'll have to see about getting some shelves for them. Anyway, leave them there for now." She went over and kneeled again by the hearth, but after a minute or two she paused in her dusting. "Can you smell anything funny?" "Well, I think it's the books, Helen. They're just a bit musty. I don't think it'll last long." But the peculiar exhalation was very pervasive, and it was redolent of extreme age. Very soon the atmosphere in our room was that of a freshly opened mausoleum. I could see Helen didn't want to hurt my feelings, but she kept darting looks of growing alarm at my purchases. I decided to say it for her. "Maybe I'd better take them downstairs, just for now." She nodded gratefully. The descent was torture, made worse by the fact that I had thought I was finished with such things. I finally staggered into the office and parked the books behind the desk. I was panting and rubbing my hands when Siegfried came in. "Ah, James, had a nice run through to Leeds?" "Yes, they said at the lab that they'd give us a ring about those sheep as soon as they'd cultured the organisms." "Splendid." My colleague opened the door of the cupboard and put some forms inside, and then he paused and began to sniff the air. James? There's a bloody awful stink in here. I cleared my throat. Well, yes, Siegfried, I bought a few books while I was in Leeds, and they seem a little damp. I pointed behind the desk. Siegfried's eyes widened as he looked at the twin edifices. What the devil are they? I hesitated. The Geography of the World in 24 volumes. He didn't say anything, but looked from me to the books and back again. And he kept sniffing. There was no doubt that only his innate good manners were preventing him from telling me to get the damn things out of here. I'll find a place for them, I said, and with a great weariness pushed my hands yet again under the strings. My mind was in a ferment as I shuffled along the passage. What in heaven's name was I going to do with them? But as I passed the cellar door on my right, it seemed to provide the answer. There were great vaulted chambers beneath Skeldale House, a proper wine cellar in the grand old days. The man who went down there to read the gas meter always described them as the catacombs, and as I descended into the murky, dank-smelling depths, I thought sadly that it was a fitting resting place for my books. We kept only coal and wood down here now, and from the muffled thuds I judged that Tristan was chopping logs. He was a great log chopper, and when I rounded the corner he was whirling the axe expertly round his head. He stopped when he saw me with my burden and asked the inevitable question. I answered, for I hoped, the last time. The Geography of the World in 24 volumes, and I followed with a blow-by-blow account of my story. As he listened, he opened one tome after another, sniffed at it and replaced it hurriedly. And he didn't have to tell me, I knew already. My cherished books were down here to stay. But the compassion which has always been and still is uppermost among the many facets of Tristan's character came to the fore now. "Tell you what, Jim," he said, "we can put them in here." He pointed to a dusty wine bin just visible in the dim light, which filtered through the iron grating at the top of the coal chute which led from the street. "It's just like a proper bookshelf." He began to lift the volumes into the bin, and when he'd arranged them in a long row, he ran his fingers along the faded opulence of the bindings. "There now, they look a treat in there, Jim." He paused and rubbed his chin. "Now, all you want is somewhere to sit. Let's see now. Ah, yes." He retreated into the gloom and reappeared with an armful of the biggest logs. He made a few more journeys, and in no time had rigged up a seat for me within arm's reach of the books. "That'll do fine," he said with deep satisfaction. "You can come down here and have a read whenever you feel like it." And that is how it turned out. The books never came up those steps again, but quite frequently when I had a few minutes to spare and wanted to improve my mind, I went down and sat on Tristan's seat in the twilight under the grating and renewed my acquaintance with the Geography of the World in 24 volumes. Chapter 15. The flu epidemic sweeping through the Derby district hit the farming folk particularly hard. The townspeople could take a few days off till it passed, but when there were cows to be milked twice a day, it couldn't be done. On my rounds I saw stocksmen flushed with fever, staggering streaming-eyed from cow to cow when they should have been in bed. Helen's father and Auntie Lucy were two of the victims and in need of help. I didn't wait for Helen to say anything about it, but suggested right away that she should return to the farm for a few days to run the house. And it was so strange in the bedsitter without her that I went back downstairs to my old room adjoining Tristan's to sleep, and I ate with the brothers in the big dining room. I was sitting at breakfast one morning with the feeling of having turned back the clock. My partner was refilling my coffee cup when his brother cleared his throat. "You know, there's maybe something in this Rains ghost business after all." Tristan pushed his chair back from the breakfast table, stretched out his legs more comfortably, and resumed his study of the Derby and Hulton Times. "It says here that they've got a historian looking into it, and this man has unearthed some interesting facts." Siegfried didn't say anything, but his eyes narrowed as his brother took out a woodbine and lit it. Siegfried had given up smoking a week ago, and he didn't want to watch anybody light up, particularly somebody like Tristan who invested even the smallest action with quiet delight, rich fulfillment. My boss's mouth tightened to a grim line as the young man unhurriedly selected a cigarette, flicked his lighter, and dragged the smoke deep with a kind of ecstatic gasp. "Yes,
Tristan continued, thin, outgoing wisps mingling with his words. "This chap points out that several of the monks were murdered at Rains Abbey in the 14th century. Well, so what?" snapped Siegfried. Tristan raised his eyebrows. "This cowled figure that's been seen so often lately near the abbey. Why shouldn't it be the spirit of one of those monks?" "What? What's that you say? Well, after all, it makes you think, doesn't it? Who knows what fell deeds might have been." "What the hell are you talking about?" Siegfried barked. Tristan looked hurt. "That's all very well, and you may laugh, but remember what Shakespeare said." He raised a solemn finger. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your—" "Oh, balls!" said Siegfried, bringing the discussion effectively to a close. I took a last thankful swallow of coffee and put down my cup. I was pleased that the topic had petered out fairly peacefully because Siegfried was in an edgy condition. Up to last week he had been a dedicated puffer of pipe and cigarettes. But he had also developed a classical smoker's cough and had suffered increasingly from violent stomachache. At times his long, thin face had assumed the appearance of a skull, the cheeks deeply sunken, the eyes smouldering far down in their sockets, and the doctor had said he must give up smoking. Siegfried had obeyed, felt immediately better, and was instantly seized with the evangelical zeal of the convert. But he didn't just advise people to give up tobacco. I've seen him several times strike a cigarette from the trembling fingers of farm workers, push his face to within inches of theirs, and grind out menacingly, "Now don't ever let me see you with one of those bloody things in your mouth again, do you hear?" Even now there are grizzled men who tell me with a shudder, "Nay, I've never had a fag since Mr. Farnan told me to stop 30 years back. Nay, bugger it, the way he looked at me I dursn't do it." However, the uncomfortable fact remained that his crusade hadn't the slightest effect upon his brother. Tristan smoked almost continuously, and he never coughed, and his digestion was excellent. Siegfried looked at him now as he contentedly tapped off a little ash and took another blissful suck. "You smoke too many of those bloody cigarettes." "So do you." "No, I don't," Siegfried retorted. "I am a non-smoker, and it's time you were too. It's a filthy habit, and you'll kill yourself the way you're going." Tristan gave him a benign look, and again his words were floating out on the fine woodbine mist. "Oh, I'm sure you're wrong. Do you know, I think it rather agrees with me." Siegfried got up and left the room. I sympathised with him, for he was in a difficult position. Being in loco parentis, he was, in a sense, providing his brother with the noxious weeds, and his innate sense of propriety prevented him from abusing this position by dashing the things from Tristan's hands as he did with others. He had to fall back on exhortation, and it was getting him nowhere. And there was another thing. He probably wanted to avoid a row this morning as Tristan was leaving on one of his mysterious trips back to the veterinary college. In fact, my first job was to take him down to the Great North Road, where he was going to hitch a lift. After I'd left him there, I set off on my rounds, and as I drove, my thoughts kept going back to the conversation at breakfast. A fair number of people were prepared to swear that they'd seen the Rains ghost, and though it was easy to dismiss some of them as sensation-mongers or drunkards, the fact remained that others were very solid citizens indeed. Now the story was always the same. There was a hill beyond Rains village, and at the top a wood came right up to the roadside. Beyond lay the abbey. People driving up the hill late at night said they had seen the monk in their headlights, a monk in a brown habit just disappearing into the wood. They believed the figure had been walking across the road, but they weren't sure because it was always a little too far away. But they were adamant about the other part. They had seen a cowled figure, head bowed, go into that wood. There must have been something uninviting about the apparition because nobody ever said that they'd gone into the wood after it. It was strange that after my thoughts had been on Rains during the day, I should be called to the village at 1 o'clock the following morning. Crawling from bed and climbing wearily into my clothes, I couldn't help thinking of Tristan curled up peacefully in his Edinburgh lodgings far away from the troubles of practice. But I didn't feel too bad about getting up. Rains was only 3 miles away, and the job held no prospect of hard labour. A colic and a little boy's Shetland pony. And it was a fine night, very cold with the first chill of autumn, but with a glorious full moon to light my way along the road. They were walking the pony round the yard when I got there. The owner was the accountant at my bank, and he gave me a rueful smile. "I'm very sorry to get you out of bed, Mr. Herriot, but I was hoping this bit of bellyache would go off. We've been parading him around here for 2 hours. When we stop, he tries to roll." "No, you've done the right thing," I said. "Rolling can cause a twist in the bowel." I examined the little animal and was reassured. He had a normal temperature, good strong pulse, and listening at his flank, I could hear the typical abdominal sounds of spasmodic colic. What he needed was a good evacuation of the bowel. But I had to think carefully when computing the dose of arecaline for this minute member of the equine species. I finally settled on 1/8 of a grain and injected into the neck muscles. The pony stood for a few moments in the typical colic position, knuckling over and sinking down on one hind leg, then the other, and occasionally trying to lie down. "Walk him on again slowly, will you?" I was watching for the next stage, and I didn't have long to wait. The pony's jaws began to champ and his lips to slobber, and soon long dribbles of saliva hung down from his mouth. All right so far, but I had to wait another 15 minutes before he finally cocked his tail and deposited a heap of feces on the concrete of the yard. "Ah, I think he'll be okay now," I said. "So I'll leave you to it. Give me another ring if he's still in pain." Beyond the village, the road curved suddenly out of sight of the houses, then began the long straight climb to the abbey. Just up there at the limits of my headlights would be where the ghost was always seen, walking across the road and into the black belt of trees. At the top of a hill, on an impulse, I drew into the side of the road and got out of the car. This was the very place. At the edge of the wood, under the brilliant moon, the smooth boles of the beeches shone with an eerie radiance, and high above, the branches creaked as they swayed in the wind. I walked into the wood, feeling my way carefully with an arm held before me, until I came out the other side. Rains Abbey lay before me. I had always associated the beautiful ruin with summer days, with the sun warming the old stones of the graceful arches, the chatter of voices, children playing on the cropped turf. But this was 2:30 a.m. in an empty world, and the cold breath of the coming winter on my face. I felt suddenly alone. In the cold glare, everything was uncannily distinct. But there was a look of unreality about the silent rows of columns reaching into the dark sky and throwing their long, pale shadows over the grass. Away at the far end I could see the monks' cells, gloomy black caverns deep in shadow, and as I looked an owl hooted, accentuating the heavy, blanketing silence. A prickling apprehension began to creep over me. A feeling that my living person had no place here among these brooding relics of dead centuries. I turned quickly and began to hurry through the wood, bumping into trees, tripping over roots and bushes, and when I reached my car I was trembling and more out of breath than I should have been. It was good to slam the door, turn the ignition, and hear the familiar roar of the engine. I was home within 10 minutes and trotted up the stairs looking forward to catching up on my lost sleep. Opening my bedroom door, I flicked on the switch and I felt a momentary surprise when the room remained in darkness. Then I stood frozen in the doorway. By the window where the moonlight flooded in, making a pool of silver in the gloom, a monk was standing. A monk in a brown habit, motionless, arms folded, head bowed. His face was turned from the light towards me, but I could see nothing under the drooping cowl but a horrid abyss of darkness. I thought I would choke. My mouth opened, but no sound came, and in my racing mind one thought pounded above the others. There were such things as ghosts, after all. Again my mouth opened and a hoarse shriek emerged. "Who in the name of God is that?" The reply came back immediately in a sepulchral bass. "Tristan." I don't think I actually swooned, but I did collapse limply across my bed and lay there gasping, the blood thundering in my ears. I was dimly aware of the monk standing on a chair and screwing in the light bulb, giggling helplessly the while. Then he flicked on the switch and sat on my bed. With his cowl pushed back on his shoulders, he lit a woodbine and looked at me, still shaking with laughter. "Oh, God, Jim, that was marvellous! Even better than I expected!" I stared up at him and managed to whisper. "But you're in Edinburgh." "Not me, old lad. There wasn't much doing, so I concluded my business and hitched straight back. I just got in when I saw you coming up the garden. I barely had time to get the bulb out and climb into my outfit. I couldn't miss the opportunity." "Feel my heart," I murmured. Tristan rested his hand on my ribs for a moment, and as he felt the fierce hammering, a fleeting concern crossed his face.
"Oh, hell, I'm sorry, Jim."
Then he patted my shoulder reassuringly.
"But don't worry. If it was going to be fatal, you'd have dropped down dead on the spot. And anyway, a good fright is very beneficial. Acts like a tonic. You won't need a holiday this year."
"Thanks," I said. "Thanks very much."
"I wish you could have heard yourself."
He began to laugh again.
A scream of terror. "Oh, dear. Oh, dear."
I hoisted myself slowly into a sitting position, pulled out the pillow, propped it against the bedhead, and leant back against it. I still felt very weak. I eyed him coldly. "So you're the rain's ghost?" Tristan grinned in reply, but didn't speak. "You young devil. I should have known. But tell me, why do you do it? What do you get out of it?" "Oh, I don't know." The young man gazed dreamily at the ceiling through the cigarette smoke. "I suppose it's just getting the timing right so that the drivers aren't quite sure whether they've seen me or not. And then I get a hell of a kick out of hearing them revving up like mad and roaring off for home. None of them ever slows down, you know." "Well, somebody once told me your sense of humour was overdeveloped," I said. "And I'm telling you it'll land you in a cart one of these days." "Not a chance. I keep my bike behind a hedge about 100 yards down the road so I can make a quick getaway if necessary. There's no problem." "Well, please yourself." I got off the bed and made shakily for the door. "I'm going downstairs for a tot of whiskey, and just remember this." I turned and glared at him. "If you try that trick on me again, I'll strangle you." A few days later, at about 8 o'clock in the evening, I was sitting reading by the fireside in the big room at Scaledale House, when the door burst open and Siegfried burst into the room.
"James," he rapped out, "old Horace Dawson's cow has split its teat. Sounds like a stitching job. The old chap won't be able to hold the cow, and he has no near neighbours to help him, so I wonder if you'd come and give me a hand." Sure, yes, glad to."
I marked the place in my book, stretched and yawned, then got up from the chair. I noticed Siegfried's foot tapping on the carpet, and it occurred to me, not for the first time, that the only thing that would satisfy him would be some kind of ejector seat on my chair, which would hurl me straight through the door and into action on the word of command. I was being as quick as I could, but I had the feeling, as always, when I was writing something for him or operating under his eyes, that I wasn't going nearly fast enough. There were elements of tension in the knowledge that the mere fact of watching me rise from the chair and replace my book in the fireside alcove was an almost unbearable strain for him. By the time I was halfway across the carpet, he had disappeared into the passage. I followed at a trot and just made it into the street as he was starting the car. Grabbing the door, I made a dive for the interior and felt the road whip away from under my foot as we took off into the darkness. 15 minutes later, we screeched to a halt in the yard behind a little small holding standing on its own across a couple of fields. The engine had barely stopped before my colleague was out of the car and striding briskly towards the cowhouse. He called to me over his shoulder as he went. "Bring the suture materials, James, will you? And the local and syringe and that bottle of wound lotion." I heard the brief murmur of conversation from within, then Siegfried's voice again, raised this time in an impatient shout. "James, what are you doing out there? Can't you find those things?" I had hardly got the boot open, and I rummaged frantically among the rows of tins and bottles. I found what he required, galloped across the yard, and almost collided with him as he came out of the building. He was in mid-shout. "James, what the hell's keeping you? You're there. Right, let's have the stuff. What have you been doing all this time?" He had been right about Horace Dawson. A tiny, frail man of about 80, who couldn't be expected to do any strong-arm stuff. Despite his age, he had stubbornly refused to give up milking the 2 fat, short-horn cows which stood in the little cobbled byre. Our patient had badly damaged a teat. Either she or her neighbour must have stood on it, because there was a long tear running almost full length with the milk running from it. "It's a bad one, Horace," Siegfried said. "You can see it goes right into the milk channel. But we'll do what we can for her. It'll need a good few stitches in there." He bathed and disinfected the teat, then filled the syringe with local anaesthetic. "Grab her nose, James," he said, then spoke gently to the farmer. "Horace, will you please hold her tail for me? Just catch it by the very end. That's the way. Lovely." The little man squared his shoulders. "Aye, I can do that fine, Mr. Farnan."
Good lad, Horace. That's splendid. Thank you. Now, stand well clear. He bent over, and as I gripped the animal's nose, he inserted the needle above the top extremity of the wound. There was an instant smacking sound as the cow registered her disapproval by kicking Siegfried briskly halfway up his Wellington boot. He made no sound, but breathed deeply and flexed his knee a couple of times before crouching down again. "Cush, pet," he murmured soothingly as he stuck the needle in again. This time the cloven foot landed on his forearm, sending the syringe winging gracefully through the air till it came to rest by a piece of good fortune in the hay rack. Siegfried straightened up, rubbed his arm thoughtfully, retrieved his syringe, and approached the patient again. For a few moments he scratched around the root of her tail and addressed her in the friendliest manner. "All right, old lady. It isn't very nice, is it?" When he got down again, he adopted a new stance. Burrowing with his head into the cow's flank and stretching his long arms high, he managed, despite a few more near misses, to infiltrate the tissues round the wound with local. Then he proceeded to thread a needle unhurriedly, whistling tunelessly under his breath. Mr. Dawson watched him admiringly. "I knows why you're such a good fellow with animals, Mr. Farnan. It's because you're so patient. I reckon you're patientest man I've ever seen." Siegfried inclined his head modestly and recommenced the work. And it was more peaceful now. The cow couldn't feel a thing as my colleague put in a long, even row of stitches, pulling the lips of the wound firmly together. When he had finished, he put an arm round the old man's shoulders. "Now, Horace, if that heals well, the teat will be as good as new. But it won't heal well if you pull at it, so I want you to use this tube to milk her." He held up a bottle of spirit in which a teat siphon gleamed. "Very good," said Mr. Dawson firmly. "I'll use it." Siegfried wagged a playful finger in his face. "But you've got to be careful, you know. You must boil the tube every time before use and keep it always in the bottle or you'll finish up with mastitis. Will you do that?" "Mr. Farnan," the little man said, holding himself very erect, "I'll do exactly as you say." "That's my boy, Horace." Siegfried gave him a final pat on the back before starting to pick up his instruments. "I'll pop back in about 2 weeks to take the stitches out." As we were leaving, the vast form of Claude Blenkiron loomed suddenly in the bar door. He was the village policeman, though obviously off-duty judging by the smart check jacket and slacks. "I saw you had so much on, Horace, and I wondered if you wanted an hand." "No, thank you, Mr. Blenkiron. It's good of you, but you're hour late. We've just done job," the old man replied. Siegfried laughed. "Wish you'd arrived half an hour ago, Claude. You could have tucked this cow under your arm while I stitched her." The big man nodded and a slow smile spread over his face. He looked the soul of geniality, but I felt as always that there was a lot of iron behind that smile. Claude was a well-loved character in the district, a magnificent athlete who bestowed lavish help and friendship on all who needed it on his beat. But though he was a sturdy prop to the weak and the elderly, he was also a merciless scourge of the ungodly. I had no first-hand knowledge, but there were rumours that Claude preferred not to trouble the magistrates with trivialities, but dispensed his own form of instant justice. It was said that he kept a stout stick handy, and acts of hooliganism and vandalism were rapidly followed by a shrill yowling down some dark alley. Second offenders were almost unknown, and in fact his whole district was remarkably law-abiding. I looked again at the smiling face. He really was the most pleasant-looking man, but as I say, there was something else there, and nothing would ever have induced me to pick a fight with him. "Right then," he said. "I was just on my way into Darrowby, so I'll say good night, gentlemen." Siegfried put a hand on his arm. "Just a moment, Claude. I want to go on to see another of my cases. I wonder if you'd give Mr. Herriot a lift into town." "Oh, I'll do that with pleasure, Mr. Farnan," the policeman replied and beckoned me to follow him. In the darkness outside, I got into the passenger seat of a little Morris 8 and waited for a few moments while Claude squeezed his bulk behind the wheel. As we set off, he began to talk about his recent visit to Bradford, where he had been taking part in a wrestling match. We had to go through Rains village on the way back, and as we left the houses behind and began the ascent to the Abbey, he suddenly stopped talking. Then he startled me as he snapped upright in his seat and pointed ahead. "Look! Look there, it's that bloody monk!" "Where? Where?" I feigned ignorance, but I had seen it all right. The cowled, slow-pacing figure heading for the wood.
Claude's foot was on the boards and the car was screaming up the hill. At the top, he swung savagely onto the roadside grass so that the headlights blazed into the depth of the wood, and as he leapt from the car, there was a fleeting moment when his quarry was in full view. A monk, skirts hitched high, legging it with desperate speed among the trees. The big man reached into the back of the car and pulled out what looked like a heavy walking stick. "After the bugger!" he shouted, plunging eagerly forward. I panted after him. "Look, wait a minute! What are you going to do to him if you catch him?" "I'm going to come across his house with me ash plant," Claude said with chilling conviction, and galloped ahead of me till he disappeared from the circle of light. He was making a tremendous noise, beating against the tree trunks and emitting a series of intimidating shouts. My heart bled for the hapless spectre blundering in the darkness with the policeman's cries dinning in his ears. I waited with tingling horror for the final confrontation, and the tension increased as time passed and I could still hear Claude in full cry. "Come out of there, you can't get away, come on, show yourself!" while his splintering blows echoed among the trees. I did my own bit of searching but found nothing. The monk did indeed seem to have disappeared, and when I finally returned to the car I found the big man already there. "Well, that's a rum one, Mr. Herriot," he said. "I can't find him and I can't think where he's got to. I was hard on his heels when I first spotted him and he can't get out of the wood because I can see over the fields in the moonlight. I've had a scout round the abbey too, but he isn't there. He's just bloody vanished." I was going to say something like, "Well, what else could you expect from a ghost?" but the huge hand was still swinging that stick and I decided against it. "Well, I reckon we better get on to Darrowby," the policeman grunted, stamping his feet on the frosty turf. I shivered. It was bitterly cold with an east wind getting up and I was glad to climb back into the car. In Darrowby I had a few companionable beers with Claude at his favourite haunt, the Black Bull, and it was 10:30 when I got into Skeldale House. There was no sign of Tristan and I felt a twinge of anxiety. It must have been after midnight when I was awakened by a faint scuffling from the next room. Tristan occupied what had been the long, narrow dressing room in the grand days when the house was young. I jumped out of bed and opened the communicating door. Tristan was in pyjamas and he cuddled 2 hot water bottles to his bosom. He turned his head and gave me a single, haggard glance before pushing one of the bottles well down the bed. Then he crawled between the sheets and lay on his back with the second bottle clasped across his chest and his eyes fixed on the ceiling. I went over and looked down at him in some concern. He was shaking so much that the whole bed vibrated with him. "How are you, Tris?" I whispered. After a few moments, a faint croak came up. "Frozen to the bloody marrow, Jim." "But where the heck have you been?" Again the croak. "In a drain pipe." "A drain pipe? Where?" The head rolled feebly from side to side on the pillow. "Up at the wood. Didn't you see the pipes by the roadside?" A great light flashed. "Of course, yes. They're going to put a new sewer into the village, aren't they?" "That's right," Tristan whispered. "When I saw that big bloke pounding into the wood, I cut straight back and dived into one of the pipes. Oh, God knows how long I was in there." "But why didn't you come out after he left?" A violent shudder shook the young man's frame and he closed his eyes briefly. I couldn't hear a thing in there. I was jammed tight with my cowl over my ears and there was a 90-mile-an-hour wind screaming down the pipe. I didn't hear the car start, and I didn't come out in case that chap was still standing there with his bloody great shillelagh." He took hold of the quilt with one hand and picked at it fitfully. "Well, never mind, Tris," I said. "You'll soon get warmed up and you'll be all right after a night's sleep." Tristan didn't appear to have heard. "They're horrible things, drain pipes, Jim." He looked up at me with hunted eyes. "They're full of muck and they stink of cat's pee." "I know. I know." I put his hand back inside the quilt and pulled the sheets up round his chin. "You'll be fine in the morning." I switched off the light and tiptoed from the room. As I closed the door, I could still hear his teeth chattering. Clearly it wasn't only the cold that was bothering him. He was still in a state of shock. And no wonder. The poor fellow had been enjoying a little session of peaceful haunting with never a care in the world, when, without warning, there was a scream of brakes, a blaze of light, and that giant bounding into the middle of it all like a demon king. It had all been too much. Next morning at the breakfast table, Tristan was in poor shape. He looked very pale, he ate little, and at intervals his body was racked by deep coughing spasms. Siegfried looked at him quizzically. "I know what's done this to you. I know why you're sitting there like a zombie, coughing your lungs up." His brother stiffened in his chair, and a tremor crossed his face. "You do?" "Yes. I hate to say I told you so, but I did warn you, didn't I? It's all those bloody cigarettes." Tristan never did give up smoking, but the rain's ghost was seen no more, and remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Chapter 16. This was one for Granville Bennett. I liked a bit of small animal surgery, and was gradually doing more as time went on, but this one frightened me. A 12-year-old spaniel bitch in the last stages of pyometritis. Pus dripping from her vulva onto the surgery table. Temperature 104, panting, trembling, and as I held my stethoscope against her chest I could hear the classic signs of valvular insufficiency. A dicky heart was just what I needed on top of everything else. "Drinking a lot of water, is she?" I asked. Old Mrs. Barker twisted the strings of her shopping bag anxiously. "Aye, she never seems to be away from that water bowl, but she won't eat, hasn't had a bite for the last 4 days. "Well, I don't know." I took off my stethoscope and stuffed it into my pocket. "You should have brought her in a long time ago. She must have been ill for weeks." "Well, not rightly ill, but a bit off it. I thought there was nothing to worry about as long as she was eating." I didn't say anything for a few moments. I had no desire to upset the old girl, but she had to be told. "I'm afraid this is rather serious, Mrs. Barker. The condition has been building up for a long time. It's in her womb, you see. A bad infection, and the only cure is an operation." "Well, will you do it, please?" The old lady's lips quivered. I came round the table and put my hand on her shoulder. "Look, I'd like to, but there are snags. She's in poor shape and 12 years old. Really a poor operation risk. I'd like to take her through to the veterinary hospital in Hartington and let Mr. Bennett operate on her." "All right," she said, nodding eagerly. "I don't care what it costs." "Oh, we'll keep it down as much as possible." I walked along the passage with her and showed her out of the door. "Leave her with me. I'll look after her, don't worry. What's her name, by the way?" "Dinah," she replied huskily, still peering past me down the passage. I went through and lifted the phone. 30 years ago, country practitioners had to turn to the small animal experts when anything unusual cropped up in that line. It is different nowadays when our practices are more mixed. In Danby now, we have the staff and equipment to tackle any type of small animal surgery, but it was different then. I'd heard it said that sooner or later every large animal man had to scream for help from Granville Bennett, and now it was my turn. "Hello, is that Mr. Bennett?" "It is indeed." A big voice, friendly, full of give. "Herriot here. I'm with Farnan in Danby." "Of course. Heard of you, laddie. Heard of you." "Oh, thanks. Look, I've got a bit of a sticky job here. I wonder if you'd take it on for me." "Delighted, laddie. What is it?" "A real stinking pio." "Oh, lovely." "The bitch is 12 years old." "Splendid." "And toxic as hell." "Excellent." "And one of the worst hearts I've heard for a long time." "Fine, fine. When are you coming through?" This evening, if that's okay with you, about 8. "Couldn't be better, laddie. See you." Hartington was a fair-sized town, about 200,000 inhabitants, but as I drove into the centre the traffic had thinned and only a few cars rolled past the rows of shop fronts. I hoped my 25-mile journey had been worth it. Dinah, stretched out on a blanket in the back, looked as if she didn't care either way. I glanced behind me at the head drooping over the edge of the seat, at the white muzzle and the cataracts in her eyes gleaming palely in the light from the dash. She looked so old. Maybe I was wasting my time, placing too much faith in this man's reputation. There was no doubt Granville Bennett had become something of a legend in northern England. In those days, when specialisation was almost unknown, he had gone all out for small animal work, never looked at farm stock, and had set a new standard by the modern procedures in his animal hospital, which was run as nearly as possible on human lines. It was, in fact, fashionable for veterinary surgeons of that era to belittle dog and cat work. A lot of the older men who had spent their lives among the teeming thousands of draft horses in city and agriculture would sneer, "Oh, I've no time to bother with those damn things." Bennett had gone dead in the opposite direction. I had never met him, but I knew he was a young man in his early 30s. I had heard a lot about his skills, his business acumen, and about his reputation as a bon viveur. He was, they said, a dedicated devotee of the work hard, play hard school. The veterinary hospital was a long, low building near the top of a busy street. I drove into a yard and knocked at a door in the corner. I was looking with some awe at a gleaming Bentley dwarfing my own battered little Austin when the door was opened by a pretty receptionist. "Good evening," she murmured with a dazzling smile, which I thought must be worth another half-crown on the bill for a start. "Do come in. Mr. Bennett is expecting you." I was shown into the waiting room with magazines and flowers on a corner table and many impressive photographs of dogs and cats on the walls, taken, I learnt later, by the principal himself. I was looking closely at a superb study of 2 white poodles when I heard a footstep behind me. I turned and had my first view of Granville Bennett. He seemed to fill the room. Not over-tall, but of tremendous bulk. Fat, I thought at first, but as he came nearer it seemed to me that the tissue of which he was composed wasn't distributed like fat. He wasn't flabby. He didn't stick out in any particular place. He was just a big, wide, solid, hard-looking man. From the middle of a pleasant, blunt-featured face the most magnificent pipe I'd ever seen stuck forth, shining and glorious, giving out delicious wisps of expensive smoke. It was an enormous pipe. In fact, it would have looked downright silly with a smaller man, but on him it was a thing of beauty. I had a final impression of a beautifully cut dark suit and sparkling shirt cuffs as he held out a hand. "James Herriot." He said it as somebody else might have said Winston Churchill or Stanley Matthews. "That's right." "Well, this is grand. Jim, is it?" "Well, yes, usually." "Lovely. We've got everything laid on for you, Jim. The girls are waiting in the theatre." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Bennett." Granville, please." He put his arm through mine and led me to the operating room. Dinah was already there, looking very woebegone. She had had a sedative injection and her head nodded wearily. Bennett went over to her and gave her a swift examination. Yes. Let's get on, then." The 2 girls went into action like cogs in a smooth machine. Bennett kept a large lay staff, and these animal nurses, both attractive, clearly knew what they were about. While one of them pulled up the anaesthetic and instrument trolleys, the other seized Dinah's foreleg expertly above the elbow, raised the radial vein by pressure, and quickly clipped and disinfected the area. The big man strolled up with a loaded needle, and effortlessly slipped the needle into the vein. "Pentothal," he said as Dinah slowly collapsed and lay unconscious on the table. It was one of the new, short-acting anaesthetics which I'd never seen used. While Bennett scrubbed up and donned sterilised gown and cap, the girls rolled Dinah on her back and secured her there with ties to loops on the operating table. They applied the ether and oxygen mask to her face, then shaved and swabbed the operation site. The big man returned in time to have a scalpel placed in his hand. With almost casual speed he incised skin and muscle layers, and when he went through the peritoneum, the horns of the uterus, which in normal health would have been 2 slim pink ribbons, now welled into the wound like twin balloons, swollen and turgid with pus. No wonder Dinah had felt ill carrying that lot around with her. The stubby fingers tenderly worked round the mass, ligated the ovarian vessels and uterine body, then removed the whole thing and dropped it into an enamel bowl. It wasn't till he had begun to stitch that I realised that the operation was nearly over, though he had been at the table for only a few minutes. It would all have looked childishly easy, except that his total involvement showed in occasional explosive commands to the nurses. As I watched him working under the shadowless lamp with the white-tiled walls around him and the rows of instruments gleaming by his side, it came to me with a rush of mixed emotions that this was what I had always wanted to do myself. My dreams, when I had first decided on veterinary work, had been precisely of this. Yet here I was, a somewhat shaggy cow doctor, or perhaps more correctly, a farm physician, but certainly something very different. The scene before me was a far cry from my routine of kicks and buffets, of muck and sweat. And yet I had no regrets. The life which had been forced on me by circumstances had turned out to be a thing of magical fulfillment. It came to me with a flooding certainty that I would rather spend my days driving over the unfenced roads of the high country than stooping over that operating table. And anyway, I couldn't have been a Bennett. I don't think I could have matched his technique, and this whole setup was eloquent of a lot of things like business sense, foresight, and driving ambition, which I just didn't possess. My colleague was finished now and was fitting up an intravenous saline drip. He taped the needle down in the vein, then turned to me. "That's it then, Jim. It's up to the old girl now." He began to lead me from the room, and it struck me how very pleasant it must be to finish your job and walk away from it just like this. In Darrowby, I'd have been starting now to wash the instruments, scrub the table, and the final scene would have been of Herriot, the great surgeon, swilling the floor with mop and bucket. This was a better way. Back in the waiting room, Bennett pulled on his jacket and extracted from a side pocket the immense pipe, which he inspected with a touch of anxiety as if he feared mice had been nibbling at it in his absence. He wasn't satisfied with his examination because he brought forth a soft yellow cloth and began to polish the briar with intense absorption. Then he held the pipe high, moving it slightly from side to side, his eyes softening at the play of light on the exquisite grain. Finally, he produced a pouch of mammoth proportions, filled the bowl, applied a match with a touch of reverence, and closed his eyes as a fragrant mist drifted from his lips. "That baccy smells marvellous," I said. "What is it?" "Navy Cut Deluxe." He closed his eyes again. "You know, I could eat the smoke." I laughed. "I use the ordinary Navy Cut myself." He gazed at me like a sorrowing Buddha. "Oh, you mustn't, laddie, you mustn't. This is the only stuff, rich, fruity." His hand made languid motions in the air. "Here, you can take some away with you." He pulled open a drawer. I had a brief view of a stock which wouldn't have disgraced a fair-sized tobacconist's shop. Innumerable tins, pipes, cleaners, reamers, cloths. "Try this," he said, "and tell me if I'm not right." I looked down at the first container in my hand. "Oh, but I can't take all this. It's a 4-ounce tin." "Rubbish, my boy. Put it in your pocket." He became suddenly brisk. "Now, I expect you'll want to hang around till old Dinah comes out of the anaesthetic, so why don't we have a quick beer, hmm? I'm a member of a nice little club just across the road." "Well, fine. Sounds great." He moved lightly and swiftly for a big man, and I had to hurry to keep up with him as he left the surgery and crossed to a building on the other side of the street.
Chapter 17.
Inside the club was masculine comfort, hails of welcome from some prosperous-looking members, and a friendly greeting from the man behind the bar. "2 pints, Fred," murmured Bennett absently, and the drinks appeared with amazing speed. My colleague poured his down apparently without swallowing and turned to me. "Another, Jim?" I had just tried a sip at mine and began to gulp anxiously at the bitter ale. "Right, but let me get this one." "No can do, laddie." He glanced at me with mild severity. "Only members can buy drinks. Same again, Fred." I found I had 2 glasses at my elbow, and with a tremendous effort I got the first one down. Gasping slightly, I was surveying the second one timidly when I noticed that Bennett was 3/4 down his. As I watched, he drained it effortlessly. "You're slow, Jim," he said, smiling indulgently. "Just set them up again, will you, Fred?" In some alarm, I watched the barman ply his handle and attacked my second pint resolutely. I surprised myself by forcing it over my tonsils, then, breathing heavily, I got hold of the third one just as Bennett spoke again. "We'll just have one for the road, Jim," he said pleasantly. "Would you be so kind, Fred?" This was ridiculous, but I didn't want to appear a piker at our first meeting. With something akin to desperation, I raised the third and began to suck feebly at it. When my glass was empty, I almost collapsed against the counter. My stomach was agonizingly distended, and a light perspiration had broken out on my brow. As I almost lay there, I saw my colleague moving across the carpet towards the door. "Time we were off, Jim," he said. "Drink up." It's wonderful what the human frame can tolerate when put to the test. I would have taken bets that it was impossible for me to drink that fourth pint without at least half an hour's rest, preferably in the prone position. But as Bennett's shoe tapped impatiently, I tipped the beer a little at a time into my mouth, feeling it wash round my back teeth before incredibly disappearing down my gullet. I believe the water torture was a favourite with the Spanish Inquisition, and as the pressure inside me increased, I knew just how their victims felt. When I at last blindly replaced my glass and splashed my way from the bar, the big man was holding the door open. Outside in the street, he placed an arm across my shoulder. "The old spaniel won't be out of it yet," he said. "We'll just slip to my house and have a bite. I'm a little peckish." Sunk in the deep upholstery of the Bentley, cradling my swollen abdomen in my arms, I watched the shop fronts flicker past the windows and give way to the darkness of the open countryside. We drew up outside a fine grey stone house in a typical Yorkshire village, and Bennett ushered me inside. He pushed me towards a leather armchair. "Make yourself at home, laddie. Zoe's out at the moment, but I'll get some grub." He bustled through to the kitchen and reappeared in seconds with a deep bowl which he placed on a table by my side. "You know, Jim," he said, rubbing his hands, "there's nothing better after beer than a few pickled onions." I cast a timorous glance into the bowl. Everything in this man's life seemed to be larger than life, even the onions. They were bigger than golf balls, brownish white, glistening. "Well, thanks, Mr. Granville." I took one of them, held it between finger and thumb, and stared at it helplessly. The beer hadn't even begun to sort itself out inside me. The idea of starting on this potent-looking vegetable was unthinkable. Granville reached into the bowl, popped an onion into his mouth, crunched it quickly, swallowed it, and sank his teeth into a second. "By God, that's good. You know, my little wife's a marvellous cook. She even makes pickled onions better than anyone." Munching happily, he moved over to the sideboard and clinked around for a few moments before placing in my hand a heavy cut-glass tumbler about 2/3 full of neat whisky. I couldn't say anything because I'd taken the plunge and put the onion in my mouth, and as I bit boldly into it, the fumes rolled in a volatile wave into my nasal passages, making me splutter. I took a gulp at the whisky and looked up at Granville with watering eyes. He was holding out the onion bowl again, and when I declined, he regarded it for a moment with hurt in his eyes. "It's funny you don't like them. I always thought Zoe did them marvellously." "Oh, you're wrong, Granville. Well, they're delicious. I just haven't finished this one." He didn't reply, but continued to look at the bowl with gentle sorrow. I realized there was nothing else for it. I took another onion. Immensely gratified, Granville hurried through to the kitchen again. This time, when he came back, he bore a tray with an enormous cold roast, a loaf of bread, butter, and mustard. "I think a beef sandwich would go down rather nicely, Jim," he murmured as he stropped his carving knife on a steel. Then he noticed my glass of whisky still half full. Come on," he said with some asperity. "You're not touching your drink." He watched me benevolently as I drained the glass, then he refilled it to its old level. "That's better. And have another onion." I stretched my legs out and rested my head on the back of the chair in an attempt to ease my internal turmoil. My stomach was a lake of volcanic lava, bubbling and popping fiercely in its crater, with each additional piece of onion, every sip of whisky setting up a fresh, violent reaction. Watching Granville at work, a great wave of nausea swept over me. He was sawing busily at the roast, carving off slices which looked to be an inch thick, slapping mustard on them and enclosing them in the bread. He hummed with contentment as the pile grew. Every now and then, he had another onion. "Now then, laddie," he cried at length, putting a heaped plate at my elbow. "Get yourself round that lot." He took his own supply and collapsed with a sigh into another chair. He took a gargantuan bite and spoke as he chewed. "You know, Jim, this is something I enjoy. A nice little snack. Zoe always leaves me plenty to go at when she pops out." He engulfed a further few inches of sandwich.
And I'll tell you something, though I say it myself. These are bloody good, don't you think so? Yes, indeed.
Squaring my shoulders, I bit, swallowed, and held my breath as another unwanted foreign body slid down to the ferment below. Just then I heard the front door open.
"Ah, that'll be Zoe," Granville said, and was about to rise when a disgracefully fat Staffordshire Bull Terrier burst into the room, waddled across the carpet, and leapt into his lap. "Feebles, my dear, come to Daddykins," he shouted. "Have you had nice walkies with Mummy?"
The Staffordshire was closely followed by a Yorkshire Terrier, which was also enthusiastically greeted by Granville.
"Yoo-hoo, Victoria, yoo-hoo!"
The Yorkie, an obvious smiler, did not jump up, but contented herself with sitting at her master's feet, baring her teeth ingratiatingly every few seconds. I smiled through my pain. Another myth exploded. The one about these specialist small animal vets not being fond of dogs themselves. The big man crooned over the two little animals. The fact that he called Phoebe Feebles was symptomatic. I heard light footsteps in the hall and looked up expectantly. I had Granville's wife taped neatly in my mind. Domesticated, devoted, homely. Many of these dynamic types had wives like that, willing slaves content to lurk in the background. I waited confidently for the entrance of a plain little housefrau. When the door opened, I almost let my vast sandwich fall. Zoe Bennet was a glowing, warm beauty who would make any man alive stop for another look. A lot of soft brown hair, large grey-green friendly eyes, a tweed suit sitting sweetly on a slim but not too slim figure, and something else. A wholesomeness. An inner light which made me wish suddenly that I was a better man, or at least that I looked better than I did. In an instant I was acutely conscious of the fact that my shoes were dirty, that my old jacket and corduroy trousers were out of place here. I hadn't troubled to change, but had rushed straight out in my working clothes, and they were different from Granville's because I couldn't go round the farms in a suit like his. "My love, my love!" he caroled joyously as his wife bent over and kissed him fondly. "Let me introduce Jim Herriot from Darrowby." The beautiful eyes turned on me. "How do you do, Mr. Herriot?" She looked as pleased to see me as her husband had done, and again I had the desperate wish that I was more presentable, that my hair was combed, that I didn't have this mounting conviction that I was going to explode into 1,000 pieces at any moment. "I'm going to have a cup of tea, Mr. Herriot. Would you like one?" No, thank you very much, but, no, not at the moment." I backed away slightly. "Ah, well, I see you've got one of Granville's little sandwiches." She giggled and went to get her tea. When she came back, she handed a parcel to her husband. "I've been shopping today, darling. Picked up some of those shirts you like so much." "My sweet, how kind of you!" He began to tear at the brown paper like a schoolboy, and produced 3 elegant shirts in cellophane covers. "They're marvellous, my pet. You spoil me." He looked up at me. "Jim, these are the most wonderful shirts. You must have one." He flicked a shining package across the room onto my lap. I looked down at it in amazement. No, really, I can't. "Of course you can. You keep it." "But, Granville, not a shirt. It's too, It's a very good shirt." He was beginning to look hurt again. I subsided. They were both so kind. Zoe sat right by me with her teacup, chatting pleasantly, while Granville beamed at me from his chair as he finished the last of the sandwiches and started again on the onions. The proximity of the attractive woman was agreeable, but embarrassing. My corduroys and the warmth of the room had begun to give off the unmistakable bouquet of the farmyard where they spent most of their time. And though it was one of my favourite scents, there was no doubt he didn't go with these elegant surroundings. And worse still, I had started a series of internal rumblings and musical tinklings which resounded only too audibly during every lull in the conversation. The only other time I ever heard such sounds was in a cow with an advanced case of displacement of the abomasum. My companions delicately feigned deafness even when I produced a shameful explosive belch which made the little fat dog start up in alarm. But when another of these mighty borborygmi escaped me and almost made the windows rattle, I thought it was time to go. In any case, I wasn't contributing much else. The alcohol had taken hold, and I was increasingly conscious that I was just sitting there with a stupid leer on my face, in striking contrast to Granville, who looked just the same as when I first met him back at the surgery. He was cool and possessed, his massive urbanity unimpaired. It was a little hard. So, with the tin of tobacco bumping against my hip and the shirt tucked under my arm, I took my leave. Back at the hospital, I looked down at Dinah. The old dog had come through wonderfully well, and she lifted her head and gazed at me sleepily. Her colour was good and her pulse strong. The operative shock had been dramatically minimised by my colleague's skillful, speedy technique, and by the intravenous drip. I knelt down and stroked her ears. "You know, I'm sure she's going to make it, Granville." Above me, the great pipe nodded with majestic confidence. "Of course, laddie! Of course!" And he was right. Dinah was rejuvenated by her hysterectomy, and lived to delight her mistress for many more years. On the way home that night, she lay by my side on the passenger seat, her nose poking from a blanket. Now and then she rested her chin on my hand as it gripped the gear lever, and occasionally she licked me lazily. I could see she felt better than I did.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.